It was March the 25th, 2022 in Mayfield, a quiet suburb of Newcastle, Australia. 21-year-old Mackenzie Anderson, known as Max to her friends, was at home in her modest apartment on Crebert Street. She was a young mother, her life revolving around her 23-month-old son. Around 10:40 p.m., a frantic call reached the local police. A neighbor, startled by screams, reported a disturbance at Mackenzie's apartment. The police rushed to the scene. When they arrived at the Mayfield Street apartment, they found a horrific scene. Mackenzie was born and raised in Newcastle, New South Wales, in a close-knit family. Her mother, Tabitha Ackret, a dental hygienist, was a pillar of support. Their bond was evident in the heartfelt tributes Tabitha later shared. Mackenzie was also close to her stepfather and friends, who described her as the heart of their circle. She had a knack for making people laugh, often sharing snippets of her life on social media, where her TikTok videos captured her humor and strength as a young mother. Her son was her world, and she poured her energy into creating a stable life for him despite the hardships she faced. Mackenzie's life hadn't been easy. By her early 20s, she was navigating the challenges of single motherhood while living in a modest unit on Crebert Street. Friends said she was determined to break free from a cycle of hardship, working to provide for her son and dreaming of a brighter future. Her relationship with Tyrone Thompson, her ex-partner, cast a long shadow over her life. The two began dating in late 2019, and their on-again, off-again relationship was marked by turbulence. By October 2021, Thompson had been jailed for assaulting Mackenzie, intimidating her, and damaging her property. An apprehended violence order was in place, meant to keep Thompson away from Mackenzie, prohibiting any contact or visits to her home. He served a short sentence with a non-parole period of just over 4 months and was released on March 9, 2022. Mackenzie's friends later revealed Mackenzie lived in constant fear, convinced Thompson would come after her once he was free. Then, she messaged a friend, saying that Tyrone had just gotten out of jail and was still being weird, harassing her. Despite the AVO, Thompson reached out to Mackenzie almost immediately after his release, calling her and sending messages from multiple social media accounts. One heartbreaking detail emerged later. Mackenzie had ordered for a new set of knives for Christmas 2021, a practical gift for her home. Those same knives would later become part of the tragedy. The night of March 25, 2022, started like any other in the quiet suburb of Mayfield, but beneath the surface of this ordinary night, a tragedy was unfolding. Mackenzie's apartment on Mayfield was a small, unassuming unit in a block of flats, the kind of place where neighbors knew each other by sight, even by name. That evening, she wasn't alone. A male friend, whose identity was closely guarded in early reports, was with her, along with her 23-month-old son, who was likely asleep in his crib. Tyrone Thompson, her ex-partner, was also present at some point during the night, despite the apprehended violence order that barred him from contacting her or visiting her home. The details of how Thompson ended up at her apartment remain murky, but court records later revealed that he had been asked to leave multiple times that evening. His refusal to comply set the stage for what would become a devastating confrontation. In panic, a neighbor dialed emergency services, describing a scene that sounded dire: a woman's voice in distress, a man's voice shouting, and the unmistakable sense that something was terribly wrong. The urgency was clear enough to prompt an immediate response from the Newcastle City Police District. When police arrived at the apartment block, they were met with a harrowing sight. Mackenzie lay lifeless on the veranda outside her unit, her body surrounded by blood. The scene was chaotic, with paramedics soon joining the officers in a frantic attempt to save her. Despite their best efforts, Mackenzie was pronounced dead at the scene. Her injuries were too severe to overcome. Her toddler son, found inside the apartment, was mercifully unharmed. Police found a man at the scene, later identified as Tyrone Thompson, sitting cross-legged legged at the top of the communal stairs, his hand bloodied and injured. He was loud and demanding medical attention for his wound. A broken knife handle and blade were found near Mackenzie, stark evidence of the brutality that had unfolded. Thompson was arrested and taken to hospital under police guard for treatment of his injury. The tragedy was the culmination of events that had been building for weeks. After his release from prison on March 9, 2022, Thompson immediately breached the apprehended violence order. He began contacting Mackenzie, calling her, messaging her from multiple social media accounts, and even reaching out to people close to her new partner. Court documents later revealed that Mackenzie had spent much of the previous 6 days with Thompson. Despite her fear of him, friends said she felt trapped, unsure how to break free from his persistent attempts to reconnect. That night, Thompson and a male friend were among those gathered at her apartment. Though the exact dynamics remain unclear, tensions escalated. The male friend, who had left earlier in the evening, returned to check on her, only to witness a horrific scene. Thompson standing over Mackenzie, who was already on the ground. Investigators later learned that Mackenzie had been trying to protect herself in the days leading up to that night. She had reached out to domestic violence advocacy groups, emailing them to request help with security measures like cameras and reinforced doors. The night of March 25th wasn't a sudden explosion of violence, but the culmination of a pattern of control and intimidation. Yet, the system allowed him back into her life just 16 days before her death. The AVO, meant to be her shield, was little more than a piece of paper. The Newcastle City Police District launched a meticulous investigation to uncover what had happened in those chaotic final moments. The investigation began at the crime scene itself. Detectives meticulously combed through Mackenzie's apartment, cataloging every detail. The veranda where her body was found was a focal point, marked by bloodstains and the shattered remnants of a knife. Forensic teams collected the fragments, knowing they could hold critical clues about the weapon and its wielder. Inside the apartment, officers found signs of a disturbance, overturned furniture, scattered belongings, and traces of blood that hinted at a confrontation that had moved from inside to the veranda. Digital evidence also became a cornerstone of the investigation. Mackenzie's phone and social media accounts revealed a trail of fear and desperation. Investigators found messages between Mackenzie and Thompson showing they had been in contact since his release. Some exchanges were tense, others oddly amicable, suggesting a complex dynamic. Thompson had also messaged people close to Mackenzie's new partner, attempting to gather information or assert control. These communications, pulled from servers and cross-referenced with phone records, showed he had breached the AVO multiple times. Detectives also explored Mackenzie's broader relationships. They interviewed her mother, Tabitha, who shared her daughter's fears about Thompson. In a statement to the court, later reported by the Newcastle Herald, Tabitha said, "Mackenzie lived in constant fear after Thompson's release." Mackenzie told Tabitha he wouldn't let her go. Friends echoed this, describing how Mackenzie had confided in them about Thompson's persistent attempts to reconnect. One friend told police she wanted to protect her son but felt trapped, like there was no way out. During police questioning, Thompson's statements were guarded but revealing. According to court reports later cited by the Newcastle Herald, he claimed the incident was a chaotic misunderstanding. He admitted to being at Mackenzie's apartment that night despite the AVO but insisted he had been invited. He described an argument that escalated, alleging that Mackenzie had been the aggressor, wielding a knife in a heated moment. His account painted a picture of self-defense, claiming his hand injury came from trying to disarm her. Though his story shifted under scrutiny, with inconsistencies about the sequence of events, he denied any intent to harm her. However, his explanation struggled to align with the physical evidence. The broken knife, Mackenzie's fatal injuries, and witness accounts of her desperation to escape. Detectives pressed Thompson about his actions in the days leading up to the incident, confronting him with evidence of his repeated AVO breaches, including messages and calls to Mackenzie and her associate. Thompson downplayed these breaches, claiming he was trying to sort things out and maintain a connection for the sake of their shared history. As Thompson remained in custody, the investigation continued to solidify the case. Forensic reports confirmed Mackenzie's blood on the knife and Thompson's DNA on the handle, strengthening the link to the crime. The autopsy of Mackenzie Anderson revealed she suffered 78 stab wounds inflicted in less than 3 minutes. On March 27, 2022, Thompson was formally charged with murder, breaching an AVO, and related offenses stemming from the events of that night. The murder charge was anchored by compelling evidence, knife fragments bearing Mackenzie's blood, witness accounts of her screams, and Thompson's presence at the scene with a suspicious injury. Additional charges included intimidating behavior, reflecting his pattern of harassment in the weeks prior. The motive, while not explicitly stated by Thompson, emerged through the investigation's findings. Detectives and domestic violence experts consulted concluded Thompson's actions stemmed from a need to regain control of Mackenzie, who was trying to move on with her life and protect her son. The presence of Mackenzie's male friend that night may have been a catalyst, intensifying Thompson's fixation. The charges against Thompson were a step toward justice. They also highlighted the failures that allowed him to remain a threat. By early 2025, the case had reached a critical juncture in the Newcastle Supreme Court, where the pursuit of justice for the 21-year-old mother unfolded. Initially set for a 4-week trial starting April 7, 2025, the case took a dramatic turn when Tyrone Thompson, then 25, changed his plea on April 1, 2025, in the New South Wales Supreme Court. He pleaded guilty to the domestic violence murder of Mackenzie Anderson, halting the need for a full trial. This plea came after years of denials, during which he had maintained his innocence even as evidence mounted against him. The guilty plea was a significant moment, sparing Mackenzie's family the pain of a protracted trial, but shifting the focus to the sentencing hearing, where the court would determine the consequences of his actions. The hearing, presided over by Justice Richard Weinstein, became a pivotal moment for all involved. The prosecution, led by Crown Prosecutor Brendan Queenan, presented a harrowing case. They argued that Thompson's actions on March 25, 2022, were a brutal culmination of a pattern of control and violence. Court documents detailed how Thompson, on parole for prior domestic violence offenses against Mackenzie, ignored an apprehended violence order and broke into her Mayfield apartment twice that night. Using 2 kitchen knives, he stabbed her 78 times in less than 3 minutes, an attack so ferocious that one knife snapped. The prosecution emphasized Mackenzie's vulnerability, noting her repeated attempts to seek safety through advocacy groups and her fear that Thompson would harm her after his release. The defense, representing Thompson, acknowledged the gravity of his actions, but sought leniency by highlighting mitigating factors. They argued that Thompson's mental health issues and challenging background diminished his moral culpability. His legal team submitted that he was not psychotic at the time of the crime, but struggled with emotional instability, which contributed to the escalation. Then, an apology letter from Thompson was tendered, in which he expressed regret, stating, "No words can undo the pain and devastation he caused to someone he genuinely loved." However, the prosecution challenged this, with Queenan noting there is some element of victim blaming. Justice Weinstein, wary of the letter's sincerity, remarked that it offered limited insight into true remorse. On May 1, 2025, Justice Weinstein delivered the sentence. Thompson was jailed for a maximum of 22 years 6 months, with a non-parole period of 15 years 6 months, making him eligible for parole in 2038. The judge described the attack as a frenzied act of such ferocity that it left Mackenzie's family shattered. Noting their helplessness, despair, and anger, he acknowledged the aggravating factors, including Thompson's prior violence and Mackenzie's fear, but also considered his guilty plea and personal circumstances when setting the term. The sentence sparked immediate outrage from Mackenzie's family, particularly her mother, Tabitha Ackert. Outside the Newcastle Supreme Court, she collapsed in tears, telling reporters that whilst it might be thought of as a good outcome for the courts, they were disgusted that that sentence was what they thought the value of her daughter's life was worth. She called the sentence an insult to women globally and demanded an appeal. On May 14, 2025, the Office of the Director of Public Prosecutions announced it would appeal Thompson's sentence, arguing that it was manifestly inadequate given the severity of the crime. Tabitha welcomed the decision, stating, "This is the first hurdle to getting a sentence that is more in line with community and moral standards." The appeal, set for a 2-hour hearing in the Court of Criminal Appeal on August 8, 2025, aims to increase Thompson's jail time. Prosecutors are citing the need to set a stronger precedent against domestic violence offenders. The case's current status leaves Thompson in prison, awaiting the appeal's outcome. While Mackenzie's family continues their advocacy, the appeal could reshape the sentence, but no verdict can undo the loss. For Mackenzie's son, now in the care of relatives and her loved ones, the fight is as much about honoring her memory as it is about ensuring others don't suffer the same fate. The question lingers: will the legal system deliver a punishment that reflects the true cost of Mackenzie's life, or will it fall short again?
Welcome back, detectives. Let's dive into another horrible case, the case of Sarah Cafferkey. Sarah Cafferkey was born on June 20, 1990 in Queensland, Australia. When she was young, her family encountered many financial difficulties, which caused tension between her parents. Eventually, her father found a better-paying job, and the family relocated to Bacchus Marsh, a suburb of Melbourne. However, moving house made the problems in her family increasingly serious. As a result, Sarah's parents are unable to mend their relationship, their disagreements leading them to realize that they cannot continue to be together. They decided to separate, and Sarah stayed with her mother. Despite their disagreements, both parents maintained a peaceful relationship to avoid affecting Sarah's life. The divorce proceedings concerning custody and property were handled amicably, as they both wanted to prioritize their daughter's well-being. At the time, Sarah and her mother lived in Bacchus Marsh, a town known for its green hills, farmhouses, and agricultural lands, where crime was rare. Even though she was an only child, Sarah never felt lonely, because they lived in a close-knit neighborhood. In her early years, it was easy for her to make friends thanks to her outgoing personality. When she wasn't with her mother, she spent time with her father in Queensland. However, as she grew older, she wanted to stay with her mother more to be closer to her friends. Due to her father's busy work schedule and his frequent visits to Bacchus Marsh to visit her, she had difficulty making friends in Queensland. Eventually, when Sarah was able to stay in Bacchus Marsh, she began visiting Queensland less often, much to her father's disappointment. Despite this, they maintained regular communication through phone calls, and her father occasionally came to visit. Both parents loved her and supported her throughout her life. When Sarah started elementary school, her mother chose the closest school, which was just a 10-minute walk from their home. There, she quickly made many friends. The route to school passed through a local swamp, a large flooded area with paths. This was the only short way for her to walk there. Along the way, she noticed an old house off to the side, unaware of how significant it would become in her life. Since first grade, Sarah has been very studious. She excelled in her studies and spent a lot of time on her homework after school. At the same time, she started participating in athletics and took part in competitions with other kids. She also started practicing karate and singing in the choir. She often expressed to her family that she wanted a brother or sister, but her mother wasn't ready for another child and declined. As a result, Sarah remained an only child. After finishing 10th grade, Sarah faced health challenges. She was diagnosed with asthma and was hospitalized, where doctors discovered that she had bronchial spasms that could escalate into serious attacks. This condition was dangerous because it could onset suddenly and lead to loss of consciousness. As a result, she had to limit her physical activities, withdraw from competitions, stop singing, and make frequent hospital visits. The main issue was the need to quickly recognize and manage potentially life-threatening attacks. This situation disrupted her plans, so much that she had to complete her final year of school through homeschooling. Due to ongoing hospital visits, she missed a substantial amount of the curriculum and struggled to catch up on missed topics. Thankfully, Sarah was diligent and determined not to give up. However, homeschooling posed significant challenges for her, leading to a loss of contact with many friends and limiting her social interactions. Despite this, she maintained regular communication and met with a few close friends. After finishing school, she had some free time and decided to get a job at a local bar. In 2011, she turned 21 and met a guy named Christopher Stewart. He seemed nice and caring, making Sarah feel happy. She believed he was the one she could spend her life with, and often shared this with her family and friends. However, her family was concerned about him from the start. They felt he was not as good as he appeared, but Sarah, infatuated with young love, ignored their warnings. Unfortunately, their concerns soon proved valid. After 2 months of dating, Christopher began to reveal a different side of himself. He had a bad reputation in the city, with rumors of using prohibited substances and possibly being involved in criminal activities. He started to manipulate Sarah, isolating her from her friends. Sadly, Sarah didn't realize it. He then began to create rifts between her and her family. Sarah once shared with her friend Ashley how she started using soft prohibited substances. Despite being persuaded not to, she found the experience captivating. Over time, she began to support her boyfriend more, which led her to drink more frequently and experiment with more powerful banned substances. By this time, he had completely replaced her friends with his group of friends, who were all living unhealthy lifestyles and were mostly substance addicts. Their home became a gathering place for various troubled individuals who would use prohibited substances for days on end. Sarah was in a difficult situation. Her friends realized that she is losing herself and try to help. However, she refused to leave Christopher. Despite this, she was starting to feel the negative effects of her substance use. She lost her job and realized she wanted to escape this harmful cycle. At one point, she attempted to detox at home, but it was unsuccessful. Eventually, she decided to check into a medical center for an addiction treatment program. After spending a week there, Sarah successfully completed the detox process and returned home. She underwent a remarkable transformation. The treatment had a positive impact on her. She even resumed her previous interests and aspirations. Now she was determined to finish her education, pursue a career as a lawyer, find a job, and travel. To successfully quit her addiction, Sarah needed to end her relationship with her addicted boyfriend, Christopher, who was a negative influence on her life. This wasn't the first time they had broken up, and he seemed indifferent to her decision, likely believing that they would get back together eventually. However, Sarah was committed to improving her life and was determined not to revert to her old ways. Eventually, Christopher understood that he couldn't win her back, which made him angry, and he began to stalk her. One day, while working at the bar, Christopher sent a 47-year-old man named Stephen James Hunter to meet Sarah. This was unusual because Stephen was not related to either of them. He had a bad reputation in the city as a cruel person linked to the criminal world, but these were just rumors, and no one had concrete evidence against him. Even though he scared her, she decided not to back down. During their conversation, Sarah got to know Stephen better. Gradually, they even started hanging out together. She described him as almost like a father figure to her, though it's unclear why such a close bond formed between them, despite their differences. At that time, Sarah's biological father lived in Queensland, and they kept in touch, which made Stephen's role in her life somewhat ambiguous. On November 7, 2012, Sarah, her friends, and Stephen were drinking together in the dormitory of a local educational institution where one of her friends was enrolled. The following day, Sarah and Stephen frequently exchanged text messages. On Friday, November 9, Sarah returned to her mother's house. She usually spent weekends with her family, but this time she had her own plans and went to visit a friend, promising to return by the end of the weekend. Sarah first stopped at a store, where she was captured on security cameras. Afterwards, she went to meet her mother on Saturday, but did not return home. By Sunday, there was still no news, and by Monday, she had not come back. Her mother became worried and reached out to several of Sarah's friends, who also had no idea where she was. The situation grew more concerning when it became clear that Sarah's car was missing along with her, indicating she had not returned home. There had been no problems in her family relationships, making it unlikely that she had run away, especially since she hadn't taken any belongings with her. The prolonged silence became increasingly suspicious. By Tuesday, November 13, there was still no word from her, so her mother contacted multiple news channels to report Sarah as a missing person. On that Tuesday, Sarah was supposed to attend her rehabilitation program, but she never showed up at the medical center. Sarah's parents began to worry about her disappearance and suspected that her ex-boyfriend, Christopher, might be involved. They questioned whether he could have kidnapped her or manipulated her in some way. Concerned for their daughter's safety, her mother contacted the police. The police quickly began their search. The first 48 hours were crucial, but they were missed, raising the possibility that Sarah might not be alive. Initially, the main suspect was her ex-boyfriend, Christopher Stewart, but he was soon cleared after investigators confirmed his alibi. The police then turned their attention to Stephen, a 47-year-old man who had a negative reputation in the community. Residents described him as having issues with self-control, anger, and legal troubles. A review of his criminal record has raised further concerns. He is known to be addicted to prohibited substances and is suspected of trafficking in prohibited substances. Several of Sarah's friends identified a man named Stephen as the last person who might have seen her alive. They believed that Sarah was visiting him. The police reached out to Stephen, who confirmed that he had seen Sarah on Saturday, November 10, when she arrived at his house near the swamp. They said goodbye that evening, as Sarah stayed behind while Stephen had to leave for a business matter, intending to return in a few hours. He stated that Sarah was supposed to wait at his house, which was near the swamp that she used to walk by on her way to school as a child. This area was a large marshy region surrounding her mother's house, and Stephen owned a small house there. On Sunday, when he returned, he found she was gone, and like everyone else, he was unable to contact her. Investigators arrived at the swamp and conducted a thorough inspection of the surrounding area, but found nothing suspicious. On November 15, the investigation progressed when police received a tip about Sarah's car. The vehicle was located parked in a small town called Morey Barron, about a half-hour drive from Bacchus Marsh. There was no connection between Morey Barron and Stephen, yet he remained a suspect. On November 17, police were granted a search warrant for Stephen's home, which was located near a swamp. When they opened the door, they were met with a pungent smell of decomposition. Inside the house, everything was in disarray, as if a struggle had occurred. Bloodstains were found in the garbage bins, various rooms, and on the stairs. Although they did not find a body, forensic scientists recovered several items from the dumpster, including a container of acid. The most notable item discovered by the police was a large green garbage can filled with concrete that had hardened quickly. Investigators immediately suspected that a body was inside. The trash was then sent to a lab for analysis, and the results confirmed their suspicions: a human body encased in concrete at the bottom of the bin. The body was compressed and deformed, indicating that it had been subjected to extreme pressure. It seemed that Stephen did not have time to dispose of the body and did not take into account that hiding the body in such a way would not mask the smell of death, which had filled the entire house. On November 20, 2012, Stephen was arrested for the murder of Sarah. During the initial interrogation, Stephen denied any involvement in the murder and also denied trying to hide the body. However, after being questioned harshly by detectives, he eventually broke down and provided his account of events, admitting to killing her. He explained that at around 7 p.m. on Saturday, November 10th, Sarah came to his house where they drank alcohol and used prohibited substances together. They then got into an argument, and in a fit of anger, she pushed Stephen and hit him in the chest. As a result, he lost control and attacked her, hitting her repeatedly in the head until she lost consciousness and fell to the floor. Stephen attacked Sarah with a hammer, causing fatal wounds to her skull and damaging her lungs and liver. Tragically, Sarah died from these injuries. Feeling lost and confused about what to do with Sarah's body, Stephen then turned to a friend. Because he was under supervision, he was determined to conceal his crime. Not wanting to face prison again, Stephen locked his house and returned with his friend. When he explained what had happened, his friend quickly distanced himself, insisting he wanted no part in the murder. Meanwhile, Sarah's body remained in a pool of blood on the kitchen floor. 2 days later, he wrapped Sarah's body in a bag, placed it in his car, and went to visit a friend named Timmy, where he confessed to the murder. At the party, Stephen asked his friend Timmy for help disposing of a body, specifically wanting to bury it. Timmy refused, expressing concern about getting into legal trouble, and suggested that Stephen turn himself in. Despite this, Timmy did not avoid the conversation. They even went to a coffee shop to grab a bite to eat, with the body still in Timmy's car. On their way back, Stephen bought a canister of hydrochloric acid, 3 bags of quick-drying cement, and a roll of black polyethylene film. After their meeting, they parted ways, and Stephen proceeded to carry out his plan, which involved encasing Sarah's body in concrete at his house in the swamp. He placed the body in the bottom of a plastic trash can and filled it with concrete. On November 14, Stephen returned to take Sarah's car and then drove to a nearby town, Morey Barron. He left the car there in hopes of confusing the investigation. During the investigation, it became clear that his negative reputation in the city was much worse than previously thought. Stephen had a long criminal history, and his life had been troubled from the start. He grew up in harsh conditions, under the abuse of his father, who bullied him and used a weapon to instill fear. His father once tied up his mother, threatening to shoot her, but he managed to call his grandparents for help. They were able to persuade his father to put the weapon down and free his mother. These traumatic experiences had a profound impact on Stephen, but they did not excuse his later actions. Even as a child, Stephen was already known to the police in his city. In 1983, when he was just 17 years old, he committed his first armed robbery. The police apprehended him and charged him, but due to his age, he avoided serious consequences. This was his first major crime. By 1986, at the age of 20, he was again in trouble with the law. He worked at a supermarket in a Melbourne suburb with an 18-year-old girl named Jacqueline, whom he had feelings for. However, she was not interested in him. Tragically, Stephen attacked Jacqueline, resulting in her death simply because she rejected his advances. He then disposed of her body, but never confessed to the crime in court. Despite his denial, the jury found him guilty, and he was sentenced to 16 years in prison. He served 13 years and was released in December. He was then 35 had spent most of his adult life in prison and is now back in Australia. Jacqueline's family opposed the situation, convinced that Stephen was beyond rehabilitation and would continue committing crimes. Unfortunately, they could not prevent his release or impose any restrictions on him. In 2005, their worst fears came to fruition when Stephen returned to court for theft, assault, and trafficking in prohibited substances. He was sentenced to 6 years in prison but was eligible for parole after 4 years. After his release, Stephen moved to Bacchus Marsh, likely because few people there knew him. Some distant acquaintances helped him find a job in road service. However, he quickly resumed distributing illegal substances, with assistance from Sarah's ex-boyfriend, Christopher. While residents recognized him as a dangerous individual, they had no idea how dangerous he truly was. After serving another prison sentence, he was released on probation, which was scheduled to end on October 30, 2012. Just over a week after his release, Stephen murdered Sarah, making the public extremely angry. People began to feel unsafe, questioning a justice system that allowed dangerous criminals to roam free without serving their full sentences. On August 21, 2013, Stephen James Hunter was sentenced to life in prison. Normally, under Australian law, murderers can apply for parole, but Stephen was denied because of his prior criminal history involving murder. Hello again, true crime fans. We've got another mysterious case to explore: the case of Browning family. In 2008, Nicholas Browning turned 15. He was considered a kind-hearted teenager and a hard-working student. As the eldest child, he grew up in a family where his father, John Browning, was a respected attorney. John was also a Boy Scout leader and Sunday school teacher, earning admiration and recognition in the local community. Nicholas's mother, Tamara, was a kind and humble housewife, while his younger brothers, Benjamin and Greg, were well-loved members of the family. The Browning family lived in a house in Cockeysville, Maryland, a small town. Nicholas was an excellent student and a dedicated Boy Scout. While in high school, he was a tall and handsome young man, active on the golf and lacrosse teams, and admired as a role model. Many believed he had a bright future ahead of him. On the surface, the family seemed to be living a happy life, until tragedy struck. On the afternoon of February 2, 2008, Nicholas's parents drove him to a friend's house for a sleepover, where Nicholas and his friends planned to watch movies and play video games. The next morning, Nicholas and his friends needed to return home. Nicholas's parents had promised to pick him up in the morning, but they did not arrive on time. He tried calling them to find out what was going on, but no one answered. Frustrated, the teens decided to go to the mall with his friend's father. After shopping, they dropped Nicholas off at his home. During the trip, Nicholas repeatedly called and texted his parents, but there was still no response. When they arrived at his house, they noticed the family car parked in the driveway, but the house was strangely quiet. When Nicholas opened the door and walked in, he witnessed a horrifying scene. His entire family had been murdered. His father, John Browning, his mother, Tamara, and his two younger brothers, Greg and Benjamin, were all dead. A friend's father called 911 to report the incident, and the police arrived quickly at the scene. They found the teenagers in the yard, visibly shaken. Nicholas immediately claimed that a robbery had taken place. He explained that while he was staying overnight with friends, someone had broken into the house. He believed that the intruders' plans had been interrupted by his parents, and as a result, the robbers had killed the entire family. However, the crime scene shows another theory. There were no signs of a struggle, and police discovered 4 victims, each killed by a single gunshot to the head, in various parts of the house. A quick inspection of the property revealed no evidence of theft. Furniture was undamaged, and valuables in plain sight had not been disturbed. There were no signs of forced entry or any disturbance, leading the police to dismiss the idea of a botched robbery. Nicholas's account and behavior raised suspicions. Despite the teenager's young age and the possibility of shock, all four boys were taken to the police station for questioning. To ensure that their statements could not be coordinated, they were separated into different rooms for individual questioning. During the interrogations, Nicholas's friends all gave the same account. They had spent the evening watching movies and playing video games until late, after which the group went to bed. They said they had not heard or seen anything unusual that night. The interview with Nicholas took place in a private room. The officer found Nicholas's behavior suspicious. When the officer entered the room, Nicholas was sitting quietly with his head down, appearing calm and even a little sleepy. An unusual reaction, considering that his entire family had just been murdered. The officer approached the conversation in a friendly manner, aiming to make it seem like a casual discussion with the witness. His goal was to gain Nicholas's trust so that he would answer truthfully. The officer hoped to secure a confession without a defense attorney present. Nicholas remained calm the interview. He explained that he had returned home from school at around 2:45 p.m. Shortly afterward, his parents decided to take him to a friend's house. Since the friend lived less than a kilometer away, they often walked to each other's houses. Nicholas told the same story as his friends, stating that they spent the evening playing video games and watching movies before going to bed. However, he admitted that he left his friend's house and went to his parents' house around midnight. His plan was to steal the family car and go out with his friends, making sure his parents didn't find out. When he got home, he noticed that the light was on in his parents' bedroom window. At that point, he climbed into the car. To avoid being seen, he lay down on the floor of the back seat. Nicholas was worried that the noise he made while opening the car door might alert his parents, but he didn't want to face his strict father's scolding. He decided to stay quiet and wait until the house was settled and everyone went back to bed. Nicholas claimed that he waited in the car and eventually fell asleep. It is possible that the shooting occurred during this time. Nicholas stated that he didn't hear anything and only woke up later before leaving. The forensic expert's report confirmed that the attack on the family occurred around midnight, killing everyone in the house. The family appeared to have been caught off guard. The first shot was fired at close range, killing the father, John, who was sleeping on the couch downstairs. Tamara and the two sons, who were sleeping upstairs, were also killed in their sleep. The police suspected that Nicholas might have been involved in the murder. His behavior raised suspicions, as he had withheld information from the police. It seemed odd that he chose to hide in the family car instead of immediately returning to his friend's house. Furthermore, Nicholas was the only survivor of the family and was home at the time of the murder. However, he claimed that he didn't hear anything, which further cast doubt on his testimony. Nicholas's claim that the lights were on in the house raised additional suspicions, as they were off when the police arrived at the scene. Considering his statement about the robbery, it was unclear why the robbers would leave the lights on during the robbery, and then turn them off afterward. Typically, criminals do not waste time on such actions. Nicholas had no explanation for these inconsistencies. The police then spoke to Nicholas's friend, who stated that Nicholas was at his house in the evening, but was no longer there when he woke up around midnight. According to his statement, Nicholas had already left by that time. This created an inconsistency in the timeline, suggesting that the teens might not be telling the truth. Due to inconsistencies in their statements, the police returned to Nicholas's friend for clarification. Initially, the friend confirmed that Nicholas was no longer at the house around midnight. However, when the police pointed out the conflicting timelines provided by others, he quickly changed his story. He then stated that Nicholas was still at the house at midnight. Nicholas's friend appeared nervous and hesitant to tell the truth, possibly in an effort to protect his friend. After being calmed down by the police, the friend admitted that after Nicholas left, he went straight to bed. He also revealed that he knew Nicholas had planned to steal his parents' car, but did not expect him to get stuck in the car or harm his family. The police then spoke to Nicholas again and shared new statements from his friends. This time, Nicholas claimed that he had left his friend's house and returned home to get his car later, at around 1 a.m. He changed his story again, stating that the lights were on when he arrived, but were off when he woke up. He assumed this meant that the robbers had entered the house while he was there. Nicholas still insisted that he had fallen asleep in his car. But how could he have slept after hearing 4 gunshots? This time, Nicholas said he had woken up at around 5 a.m. when his friend called him. Instead of returning to his parents' house, he went back to his friend's house without his car. Although Nicholas was increasingly under suspicion, he tried to remain calm. At times, he even laughed and joked during conversations, which the police interpreted as an attempt to mislead them. Nicholas appeared innocent, but the police believed there was something much more sinister behind his facade. When Nicholas eventually returned home with his friends, they entered the house through the garage. Nicholas invited his friends inside, which seemed unusual. Once inside, Nicholas pointed out that the garage door was open, which he found strange since his family always kept it closed. According to his friend's father, Nicholas repeatedly emphasized this to everyone present before they entered. As they walked through the living room, Nicholas led the way. He was the first to see his father lying on the couch, covered in blood. Shocked, Nicholas shouted to the others. His friend saw the body but immediately ran outside, refusing to go any further. During questioning, Nicholas confirmed all of these details. What worried the police most was the calm, emotionless way he spoke about everything, which was highly unusual for someone grieving the loss of a family member. When this story became public, people were shocked and tried to understand what had happened to Nicholas's family. Later, in his defense, Nicholas admitted that the car keys had been in his coat pocket the entire time. He remembered them when he visited his friend's house, and that was when he hatched the plan to steal the family car. The police were puzzled as to why he had not revealed this information earlier. They believed he was hiding something and lying again. Nicholas's friend stated that Nicholas had called home and asked his younger brother to leave the back door open, although the reason for this request was unclear. After this revelation, however, the police became certain that Nicholas had committed the murder of his family. He also told the police that his father owned 2 guns and had taken him hunting many times, so he was familiar with using them. Nicholas's friends revealed that he frequently had conflicts with his father, who had caught him drinking on multiple occasions. However, Nicholas claimed that a man who lived near his family was capable of such a brutal crime. He was referring to a neighbor who was a drug user and had a history of legal trouble. The police, however, believed this was an attempt to shift blame and divert suspicion from himself. There was no evidence against the neighbor, and he had a solid alibi. When the police publicly identified Nicholas as the prime suspect, he appeared very nervous and insisted that he was innocent. He later claimed that his parents were extremely cruel and that he had suffered years of mental and physical abuse at their hands. During questioning, Nicholas repeatedly asked the police if he could be treated in a psychiatric hospital instead of receiving a life sentence. The police did not give a clear answer to this question. However, Nicholas's suspicious interest played against him. Nicholas clearly realized his guilt and hopefully reduced the severity of the punishment. By the end of the interrogation, there was sufficient evidence against Nicholas, but his motives remained unclear. According to his friends, Nicholas had argued with his father shortly before the murder. He later recounted several instances in which his father had treated him harshly, even resorting to violence. Nicholas mentioned that their relationship had significantly worsened during the fall. It seems that the challenges of adolescence had a major negative impact on his behavior. His father, known for being strict, had tried to discipline and correct his son's behavior. According to Nicholas's testimony, on the day of the incident, he went to visit friends after his father had spanked him that morning for reasons Nicholas considered unreasonable. Police suspect that the punishment stemmed from the teenager's refusal to obey his parents. Friends' testimonies indicated that Nicholas, like many teenagers, had started to rebel. Tensions with his father were especially high after Nicholas was caught drinking on multiple occasions. Nicholas explained that he drank as a way to cope with his problems. Some relatives supported this claim, describing his father as a stern man. In interviews with Nicholas's classmates and close circle, police learned that the circumstances leading up to the massacre had been developing long before the actual event. However, it remains unclear why he killed his mother and younger brothers, who had not harmed him. Many classmates recalled him sharing stories about how he could no longer handle the abuse and emotional pressure from his father. While many described Nicholas as a hard-working and calm, kind student, his closest friends were aware of his darker side. Outside of school, he often beat his younger brothers, stole alcohol from his father's bar, and even took the family car without permission. Nicholas displayed troubling behavior, frequently bullying younger students and those with disabilities. Nicholas eventually broke down and confessed to killing his parents and younger brothers, though his explanation was both strange and disturbing. He claimed that during a sleepover with friends, he had returned home, sneaked in, and found his father asleep on the couch. Nicholas took a gun, contemplated his actions for about half an hour, and then decided to go through with it. He shot his father, and since everyone in the house was asleep, no one heard the gunshots. However, he did not stop there. After killing his father, he went upstairs and killed his mother before entering younger brother's room, where he also killed both of them. Nicholas admitted he killed younger brothers because they would have called the police. He explained that he had asked one of younger brothers to leave the door unlocked the day before, suggesting the murders may have been premeditated. Nicholas claimed he shot his family members in the head to ensure they would not suffer lasting pain. He then led police to the location of the murder weapon, which he had hidden in bushes on his family's property. Ballistic tests confirmed the weapon was used in the murders, and DNA evidence matching Nicholas's was found on the gun's barrel. He was eventually formally charged with 4 counts of first-degree murder. Many people viewed Nicholas positively, so much so that after his arrest, the court received several letters pleading for leniency. One of these letters came from his grandfather, who claimed that Nicholas had endured years of physical and mental abuse from his father. Some people found it hard to believe that Nicholas could be guilty. While awaiting trial just 2 days before it began, Nicholas was in prison and made a phone call to a friend. Their conversation, which was recorded, included Nicholas joking about escaping. This behavior indicated that he felt no remorse and did not grasp the seriousness of his actions. However, during the trial, the mood changed dramatically. At one point, Nicholas burst into tears and apologized to his relatives, expressing deep remorse. The prosecution used this moment to portray him as manipulative, citing it as evidence of his two-faced nature. On the other hand, the defense argued that such a seemingly upright young man could not be a cold-blooded killer. These conflicting portrayals became a central focus of the trial. The prosecution highlighted Nicholas's darker side, supported by testimony from numerous witnesses, while the defense emphasized his positive qualities, including his involvement in the Boy Scouts and his excellent academic record. During the hearing, Nicholas became so emotional that he was unable to read his apology speech, leaving his attorney to read it for him. The defense's claim that Nicholas was insane was quickly dismissed. During interviews with the police, he had shown no signs of mental illness. Furthermore, he had no history of mental health problems or disorders. Despite this, his attorney pushed for Nicholas to be sent to a psychiatric facility that provided rehabilitation programs for juvenile offenders. The defense argued that Nicholas's motive for the crime was unconvincing. If it had been for money, he would not have been able to access it until adulthood. Killing his family would have only worsened his circumstances, potentially placing him in an orphanage or foster care. This suggested that Nicholas did not fully understand the consequences of his actions. A psychiatric evaluation was conducted, which concluded that Nicholas was mentally fit to stand trial. This ruled out the use of mental health as a defense. Since crimes like this are punishable by death under state law, Nicholas faced serious consequences. However, due to his age, he was not eligible for the death penalty. In January 2009, Nicholas finally reached a plea agreement with the prosecution. Nicholas Browning pleaded guilty to all charges, and a jury sentenced him to 4 life terms. He is currently incarcerated at a correctional facility in Cumberland, Maryland. In 2014, he requested that his sentence be reconsidered, but his request was denied. In Maryland, granting a pardon for a life sentence requires the governor's approval, which has not occurred in the state since 1994. This makes it unlikely that Nicholas will ever be released. Angel Ormston was born in 1975 in Mentor-on-the-Lake, a quiet suburb of Ohio, USA. This area has about 7,000 residents, and everyone knows each other. Children from local families often get along and grow up together. Life here is very simple and similar. The local high school serves as the main place of learning for most young people in town. Angel is a friendly and cheerful girl. She particularly enjoys walking around the area with her friends and often drives around with loud music. Local teenagers often gathered at a large shopping mall in a nearby, bigger city, which featured restaurants, a movie theater, and various stores. It made sense that Angel would find a part-time job there. In the summer of 1992, she started working at a fast food restaurant as she prepared for her senior year of high school. This job not only allowed her to earn some pocket money but also helped her save up for college. Her daily routine was consistent. She worked in the mornings and spent time with friends afterward. On the evening of July 31, 1992, 17-year-old Angel planned to go to her restaurant to pick up her paycheck and do some shopping. She promised her mother, Jackie, she would be home before the mall closed. Initially, her mother was not concerned and went to bed, assuming she was out with friends. The next morning, she woke up to find Angel missing from her room. Despite this, she didn't worry too much because it was common for her daughter to stay over at friends' houses, especially on weekends and holidays, so she pushed her uneasy thoughts aside. In this close-knit community, crime was rare, and young people often visited each other without worry. However, Angel, a high school student, didn't always keep her mother informed, which led to concerns. Her mother didn't want to restrict Angel too much, allowing her daughter considerable freedom that matched her independent spirit. Angel's upbringing was relaxed, her mother was adaptable and aimed to maintain a harmonious environment. Meanwhile, her father was often away as a long-distance truck driver. Despite the lack of strict rules or curfews in the Angel household, unsettling thoughts began to creep into Jackie's mind. Angel was missing all Saturday, and when her mother woke up on Sunday to find she still hadn't returned home, worries began to set in. She called families where Angel could stay, and her brother also went to the shopping center where she worked. Upon arriving at the parking lot, Angel's brother noticed her Honda Civic, which heightened his concern. He hoped to find Angel inside but instead found her purse, comb, and other personal items left on the driver's seat, indicating she might have vanished. He checked the burger joint where she worked but learned she hadn't shown up for a couple of days. Alarmed, he contacted Jackie, their mother, who hurried to the shopping center to retrieve Angel's car and uncover the truth while pushing aside her fears. Initially, she hoped it was just a series of coincidences. Angel often went out at night with her best friend, Stacy. That day, Stacy's family could not be reached, which gave Jackie some peace of mind. Nonetheless, anxiety grew as Jackie drove around the mall looking for Angel, but she found no trace of her daughter. Friends who did manage to contact her hadn't seen Angel since Friday. By 8 p.m., Jackie still couldn't reach Angel, deepening her worry. Jackie finally decided to report her daughter Angel as missing by going to the police. Although Angel was last seen on July 31st, Jackie did not visit the station until August 2nd. This delay raised suspicions among the police, but Jackie explained that she believed she needed to wait 48 hours before reporting someone missing. Jackie provided detailed information about Angel, including her life and relationships. Jackie asserted that, up until the very last moment, she was not worried that anything serious had happened to Angel. On the morning of Monday, August 2nd, Jackie managed to reach Stacy, who confirmed Jackie's fears. Stacy had spent the entire weekend at her sister's house and hadn't seen Angel. She was shocked to learn that her friend had been missing for over 2 days. Stacy tried to contact some mutual friends, but none had seen Angel. Following this, Jackie provided the police with new information, prompting them to initiate an active search for Angel. The police first examined Angel's car, which showed no signs of a struggle. The car was in normal condition, with no blood, signs of theft, or forced entry. The officers believed Angel may have left the car willingly. Given her age, they suggested she could have run away, but Jackie rejected this idea, citing their good relationship. Angel was not involved with banned substances and had always remained calm during her teenage years. Despite her independent nature, she was not the type to run away. In fact, she had been making future plans, including furthering her education at university. Detectives worked extensively to investigate Angel's disappearance. They suspected she might have been kidnapped from the car and collected many fingerprints at the scene. Although there were numerous prints, all belonged to family and close friends. Despite this, every individual had to be investigated to clear them as suspects since there were no other leads. The investigation began with Angel's father, a truck driver, but he was quickly ruled out because he had a verified alibi. He was in another state when his daughter went missing. Next, detectives looked into Angel's mother, Jackie. Her refusal to take a polygraph test raised significant suspicion and drew the attention of the investigators. They noted her delay in contacting the police and her decision to take Angel's car from the parking lot soon after learning about the disappearance, which further fueled suspicions. The police lacked the authority to compel her to take a polygraph test, and there was no direct evidence against her. As a result, the investigation continued with Jackie being the primary suspect. Jackie claimed that on the evening when Angel left home, she intended to go to a burger place. However, interviews with local staff revealed that Angel never arrived to pick up her paycheck that day. Investigators seized the opportunity to gather more information from Angel's colleagues. They quickly eliminated Jackie from the list of suspects due to Angel's good relationship with her family. However, they developed several other theories, including a suspicious connection to a former manager known for inappropriate behavior toward female employees. Investigators suspected that the former manager had been spying on female staff while they changed into their work uniforms. Later, he was fired for a harassment incident. Several female employees reported that this manager had touched them inappropriately. When the police investigated him, they discovered he had a criminal record for inappropriate behavior with minors, making him the main suspect. Other women also mentioned that he frequently focused on Angel, often looking for chances to be alone with her in the kitchen and making inappropriate comments. When this was discovered, the detectives were so focused on the case that they overlooked Jackie. The former manager was quickly located and interviewed, but he denied any involvement in Angel's disappearance. He said that she hasn't seen him since they worked together. He claimed that, on the day she went missing, he was far from his hometown and provided a timesheet showing that he was at another location of the fast food chain that day. Despite this evidence, detectives did not exclude him as a suspect and continued to question everyone at the restaurant, including both staff and management. Through their investigation, they uncovered a secret that Angel had kept from her family. She had been fired for consistently being late. While she was indeed heading to the restaurant to collect her final paycheck, this revelation did not provide any new leads regarding her disappearance. Gradually, all of Angel's co-workers were ruled out as suspects because they had alibis. Neither Angel's former manager nor her mother was considered a viable suspect in the case, making it difficult for the police to conduct their investigation. Communication with Angel's closest friends did not reveal any new information. Everyone was shocked at the idea that someone in her circle might wish her harm. She was gentle, trusting, and usually avoided conflict. However, her trusting nature made her vulnerable to someone who might manipulate her into a dangerous situation. After a long period without contact, fears grew that Angel had died. She hadn't reached out to anyone, appeared in public, or used any payment methods. Given these circumstances, the police decided to re-examine the people closest to her, as those responsible for such crimes are often found among acquaintances. The focus shifted to her best friend, Stacy. Although they had spoken to her briefly before, this time the interview lasted over 4 hours. From the start, Stacy expressed a strong willingness to help but firmly denied any involvement. She was cleared as a suspect when she provided a confirmed alibi. She had spent the entire weekend at her sister's house and they had been together the whole time, cooking side by side. The police are trying to ask Stacy if she knows about Angel's relationship with a man. Stacy revealed that Angel had recently become interested in a young man named Mark Sotka, a 19-year-old who had just graduated with honors from their high school. Stacy explained that Angel had been in love with Mark for a long time and even hoped to start a serious relationship with him. However, Angel was very private, especially about her relationships, and only Stacy knew about Mark, not even sharing it with her mother. During the questioning, Stacy reveals that Angel was aware of her pregnancy shortly before she disappeared. They had talked several times about the possibility of telling Mark about the baby, and Angel was optimistic that he would accept her and the child, viewing it as the start of their life together. Stacy was doubtful, but Angel was convinced she could build a family with Mark. The detectives decided to investigate Mark's background before confronting him. It appeared that Mark was not ready for fatherhood. Just before Angel went missing, he started college, which suggests he may have only considered Angel a short fling while planning to focus on his studies. They found no incriminating evidence against him, as he had a clean record and a solid reputation in school. Eventually, Mark was called to the police station for questioning. He was surprised to learn that he was considered a suspect in Angel's disappearance. He denied any involvement and refuted Stacy's claims about their relationship. When he learned that Angel might be pregnant, he laughed it off, dismissing it as a fabrication by his girlfriend. He admitted to having had a brief encounter with Angel at the beginning of summer but said they had not met again since then. Additionally, he had been in a relationship with another girl for 2 years. To support his claims, he needed to provide proof and a reliable alibi. Mark testified that he left work at 5 p.m. on July 31, 1992 to go to a shopping mall. He intended to buy a gift for his girlfriend and then meet friends at a pizzeria. The police began to investigate his account closely. His employment at a car dealership was verified through his timesheet, which matched his claimed working hours. Additionally, they found a receipt for the gift purchase. Several friends from work supported his story, confirming he was at the pizzeria until around 9 p.m. The only inconsistency was that some staff members at the places he visited that evening did not remember him. However, Mark willingly took a polygraph test, which showed no evidence of his involvement in any crime. As a result, he was cleared as a suspect. The investigation hit another dead end, prompting detectives to revisit earlier theories of escape or kidnapping. Discovering that Angel might have been pregnant reinforced these theories. Her family may have opposed her having a child at just 17, leading her to potentially run away to start a new life with the baby. Unfortunately, these possibilities did not bring them any closer to finding her. Frustrated by the lack of progress, Angel's mother decided to take action. She reached out to the community through local media in hopes of gathering information. Her appeal successfully raised awareness about Angel's disappearance, turning the incident into a well-known topic of discussion. Friends and concerned individuals joined in, distributing thousands of leaflets. Charities became involved, and a fund was established, raising $10,000 as a reward for anyone who could provide useful information for the investigation. In the following weeks, the police department received numerous requests for information, which opened several new leads for the investigation. Detectives conducted thorough checks, but these efforts did not yield any significant results. Frustrated, Angel's family made the decision to hire a private detective. When Angel's father returned from a trip, he was hopeful that it would help locate his daughter, unlike the ineffective efforts of the police. However, despite the detectives' hard work, no new information emerged. 3 months passed, and there were still no updates on Angel's case. By this time, her friends had almost lost hope, but her mother remained determined. Angel's mother, Jackie even altered the message on their answering machine, leaving a note for her daughter in the hopes that she would eventually call. She refused to believe that anything bad had happened to Angel. Meanwhile, the entire city was critical of the police for their lack of progress, which led to increased pressure on law enforcement to revisit existing leads and suspects. Eventually, detectives began to focus on a man who was engaged to Angel's best friend. He was very interested in finding out what happened to her and was vocal in his criticism of the investigation. His name was Candle. Even though he showed a strong interest in Angel, he did not give any information to the detectives or the media. It was believed that he had attempted to start a relationship with Angel and was rejected, which might have led to her kidnapping or murder. On the day she went missing, he was working at a shoe store in the shopping mall where she was last seen. He had a confirmed alibi for that time, but after work, he could have committed a crime, especially since he was nearby. He allowed investigators to search his car, but nothing suspicious was found. The investigation had reached another dead end. On December 15, 1992, 4.5 months after Angel's disappearance, a local resident was out hunting with his dog. While walking through the forest, the dog became uneasy and led its owner away. This took them to a drainage ditch, where the hunter noticed something wrapped in a sheet and tied with a rope. Upon closer inspection, he saw a human hand protruding from the package. The man quickly contacted the police. When law enforcement arrived, they discovered a body in an advanced state of decomposition. Identification was possible only through dental records, which confirmed that it was 17-year-old Angel Ormston, who had been reported missing. On December 16th, Angel's family was informed of her death. An autopsy showed she had suffered blunt force trauma to the head, which might not have been fatal. However, she had sustained 2 stab wounds to the chest, both delivered with significant force, impacting her heart. As a result, she bled out quickly and died. Investigating her death was complicated by decomposition, but fibers resembling those from a blue carpet were found at the scene. The police compiled a list of all homes associated with Angel, including those of neighbors, family, and friends, in search of a home that might have green carpeting. One key location of interest was the house belonging to Mark, who might have been the father of Angel's unborn child. At the time of the murder, the house was empty as it was for sale. Witnesses claimed they saw Mark enter the house with a girl who matched Angel's description. Although the house had been sold by then, the new owners allowed detectives to inspect it. Most rooms had been renovated, except for the basement. Upon entering the basement, the police found a blue carpet that matched the fibers collected from the scene. Additionally, a clothesline similar to the one used by the killer to move the body was discovered in the laundry room, matching the one found on Angel. The new owners reported that both the carpet and the clothesline had been left behind by the previous owners. These items were sent for forensic analysis, and tests confirmed that the microscopic fibers and the rope matched those used in the crime. Furthermore, a bloody fingerprint was discovered in the basement. 5 months after Angel disappeared, on December 31, 1992, 19-year-old Mark Sotka was arrested on suspicion of murder. During his arrest, he insisted that the police had no evidence against him and claimed he was not the person they were looking for. He immediately refused to cooperate with detectives, prompting forensic experts to conduct a detailed examination of his car. They discovered that although he had attempted to clean the interior, a few small drops of blood remained. During questioning, Mark eventually broke down due to the overwhelming evidence against him. He admitted to committing an act he described as stupid. When pressed for more details, he confessed to murdering Angel. Mark explains that he invited Angel to his house for intimate relations again, but things changed that night when she revealed that she was pregnant and that he was the father. This news triggered a violent outburst from him. He demanded that she get an abortion, but she refused. An argument ensued, during which Angel threatened to cause problems. In a fit of rage, Mark struck her several times in the face. Angel fell in the garage, and Mark, grabbing a knife, returned to the basement and stabbed her twice in the chest. Afterward, he calmly met with his friends at a pizzeria, chatting and laughing as if nothing had happened. Later that evening, he wrapped her body in a sheet, secured it with a clothesline, and transported it in the trunk of his car to a wooded area, where he left it in a ditch. Afterward, Mark returned home, covered up the evidence of the crime, and cleaned his car. After 5 months of investigation, he was arrested as the killer. During questioning, Mark confessed to first-degree murder and led authorities to the location where he disposed of the knife used in the crime. Despite thorough searches, the knife was never found. However, he had limited chances of proving his innocence. The motive for the attack stemmed from Angel's pregnancy, which disrupted his future plans. Mark had no intention of continuing his relationship with her and wanted to focus on someone else. In February 1993, to avoid the death penalty that was in place at the time, Mark officially admitted his guilt. Consequently, he was sentenced to life in prison but became eligible for parole after 30 years. Angel's family pointed out that Mark showed no remorse or compassion, which explained how he was able to deceive the polygraph test. Following his sentencing, he was taken to jail. After serving 20 years, Mark utilized an old Ohio law that allowed him to request a parole hearing after 2/3 of his minimum sentence. His family was informed, and Angel's relatives increased their efforts to prevent him from being released. Their efforts were successful, and he was denied parole in July 2023. After serving 30 years, Mark appeared before the parole board again, but this time, Angel's family opposed his release once again. As a result, he remains in prison. Angel's family expressed their relief to the media, calling it a significant victory for them. Her mother stated that their family would continue to fight to keep the killer incarcerated and would never forgive Mark, who has never expressed remorse or sought forgiveness for taking Angel's life and the life of her baby. On the evening of May 28, 2023, 29-year-old Julia Tramontano vanished without a trace. 7 months pregnant, she stopped responding to calls and messages from loved ones. The first person to report her disappearance was the man she lived with, Alexander Impagnatiello. He insisted that when he returned home from work, he found the apartment empty and had no idea where his partner could have gone. From the very beginning, there were too many unusual details in this case. Julia had left behind most of her personal belongings, and her plans for the near future gave no indication that she intended to disappear. As investigators began piecing together her last known activities, they uncovered even more troubling facts. The night before she went missing, Julia had sent messages to her mother, Loredana Femiano, and a close friend, revealing that she had had a serious argument with Alexander. She was deeply upset and wrote that the situation was causing her a great deal of distress. But the most important question remained unanswered: what really happened that fateful evening? If Julia had truly left the house on her own, why had no one seen her since? In the days that followed, investigators would begin unraveling a web of deception that would lead to a grim truth. Julia was born on May 2, 1994, in a small town in the province of Naples. She grew up in a close-knit family where support and warmth were always present. Her parents encouraged independence and self-confidence from an early age. While they embraced modern views, family traditions remained a cornerstone of their lives, and home was always a place she could return to for guidance, comfort. Julia attended a local school, excelling in the humanities. She was drawn to real estate, fascinated by architecture, investment opportunities, and the idea of becoming a successful real estate agent. After high school, she pursued a degree in the field, quickly mastering the profession thanks to her analytical mindset and strong communication skills. By the age of 25, she had built a solid reputation in the industry, but for Julia, this wasn't enough. She dreamed of life in a big city filled with opportunities. By the time she turned 26, her career in her hometown had reached a plateau. Working at a real estate agency, she realized the local market had its limitations. Inspired by her friends' stories, she decided to move to Senego, a suburb of Milan, where she believed would offer her a new chapter filled with potential. By the end of 2018, her decision was final. Senego symbolized independence, new connections, and the career growth she longed for. The transition happened quickly. Packing her belongings and saying goodbye to her loved ones, she set off for the city that she hoped would become her new home. After moving to Senego, Julia immediately immersed herself in work. The city's real estate market was fast-paced, competitive, required confidence and persistence. She adapted quickly, building connections, attending networking events, and closing deals. Her new life was exciting, but amid her busy schedule, she found herself longing for something more: personal happiness. It was during this time that she met Alexander. Their paths crossed at a Milan bar where her colleagues had invited her to celebrate a successful deal. Alexander worked as a bartender at a high-end lounge inside a five-star hotel. A year older than Julia, he was charming, outgoing, and had a natural ability to connect with people. His confidence and charisma drew her in. With him, she felt like she could relax, momentarily escape the pressures of work, and simply enjoy the present. The first few weeks of their relationship felt effortless. They spent evenings dining at restaurants, strolling through the city at night, and talking about the future. Alexander shared that he had a son from a previous relationship but assured her that his past was behind him and that he was now looking for stability. Julia sincerely hoped that her move to Senegal would bring not only career growth but also personal fulfillment. She was convinced that Alexander was the person she was meant to build a future with. Julia believed she had finally met someone with whom she could build a lasting relationship. Their romance moved quickly, and within a few months, they decided to move in together. She had no idea what secrets he was hiding or how much her decision would change the course of her life. Tensions in Julia's relationship with Alexander were growing. She felt that something was wrong, but she couldn't pinpoint the issue. As time went on, the discomfort increased, while Alexander continued to act as if everything was normal. By the end of 2022, Julia noticed changes in her body: constant fatigue, strange cravings, and a missed period led her to suspect that something was different. Not wanting to wait any longer, she bought a pregnancy test. She then realized she was pregnant. This news brought mixed feelings. She had always wanted a family, but the past few months with Alexander had been challenging. Nonetheless, she knew she needed to tell him in person. Nervously, Julia chose the right moment to share the news. She had thought about various possible reactions: surprise, joy, maybe even fear, but Alexander's expression was unreadable. After a few seconds of silence, he finally asked one question: "Are you sure?" Julia felt the chilling distance in his demeanor. He showed no curiosity and asked no questions about how far along she was or how she was feeling. His indifference was impossible to ignore. In the days that followed, he never brought up the topic again. No discussions about the future, no interest in upcoming doctor's visits. Julia felt abandoned but held on to hope that in time he would come to terms with the situation. The new year began, but Alexander's attitude remained unchanged. More and more, Julia found herself spending evenings alone, contemplating her future. She kept working, trying to focus on other things, but an uneasy feeling grew inside her. Meanwhile, Alexander's double life took an unexpected turn. In early 2023, he learned that his other partner, Allegra Syria, was also expecting. The news caught him completely off guard. Just like Julia, Allegra had no idea that another woman was in her life. She truly believed she and Alexander were in a committed relationship. Unlike Julia, however, Allegra was unsure whether she wanted to continue the pregnancy. Alexander convinced Allegra that having a child wasn't the right decision at that moment. He assured her that he would support whatever choice she made, but strongly implied that ending the pregnancy would be for the best. Allegra hesitated for a long time but eventually agreed. Alexander accompanied her to the medical procedure, ensuring that this chapter was closed. He hoped that with Allegra's pregnancy no longer an issue, he could now focus on dealing with what he saw as his bigger problem: Julia's decision to have the baby. Unlike Allegra, Julia was determined to continue her pregnancy. Despite his emotional distance, Alexander repeatedly tried to persuade her to reconsider, but Julia refused to change her mind. For her, this was a conscious and personal decision. She knew that her relationship with Alexander was falling apart, but she was prepared to raise the baby on her own. What she didn't realize was that this choice would become a turning point in her life. After Julia refused to terminate the pregnancy, Alexander realized he was losing control of the situation. Her firm decision disrupted his plans and forced him to look for another way to free himself from what he saw as a problem. He had begun systematically researching poisons. He scoured the internet for methods to cause harm without raising suspicion, analyzing which substances were both effective and difficult to detect. His research covered chemical compounds found in household products, plant-based toxins, and even highly dangerous substances like cyanide. However, most of the options he found were either too difficult to obtain or left clear traces in the body. Eventually, he settled on rodenticides, products designed to eliminate rodents. These were widely available over the counter and wouldn't raise any red flags. He also found information suggesting that certain types worked slowly, causing internal bleeding, weakness, and anemia symptoms that could easily be mistaken for pregnancy complications. After, Alexander began putting his plan into action. He started adding small amounts of the toxic substance to Julia's food and drinks, hoping that her health would gradually decline. Within weeks, she began experiencing unusual symptoms: constant exhaustion, dizziness, nausea, and sharp abdominal pain. Julia confided in her friends about how unwell she felt but assumed it was just part of the pregnancy. She had no idea that something much more sinister was happening. Alexander closely monitored her condition, expecting the effects to intensify, but the poison wasn't working as quickly as he had hoped. Frustrated, he continued to try increasing its dosage, but the results were still disappointing. Julia still felt sick, but her body was fighting back, and the pregnancy was progressing. This infuriated Alexander. His original plan had failed, and now he was forced to consider another way out. Alexander was accustomed to being in control of situations. He skillfully crafted his lies, knowing exactly what to say to persuade each woman to accept his version of reality. Julia thought he was merely going through a tough time and believed he would eventually come to terms with the pregnancy. Allegra, meanwhile, was convinced that his past relationship had ended long ago. But one misstep shattered his carefully maintained facade. The first sign of trouble for Allegra was how uncomfortable Alexander became whenever his past was mentioned. He avoided talking about his life before they met, never shared his social media accounts, and didn't mention his ex. Initially, this didn't seem suspicious, but over time, the inconsistencies began to accumulate. The turning point occurred when she accidentally discovered recent photos on his phone, images of him with Julia. Their expressions and body language indicated that their relationship was still very much alive. Allegra didn't want to leap to conclusions, so she started observing him more closely and taking mental notes. He frequently left in the evenings, saying he was working late, but his co-workers at the hotel disclosed that he had actually clocked out early. At times, he wouldn't answer his phone, only to later offer excuses that didn't quite make sense. When Allegra confronted Alexander about the photos, he responded immediately. He accused Julia of being unable to accept their breakup and spreading the pictures to make him feel guilty. Allegra wanted to trust his explanation, but it felt off to her. As she asked more questions, Alexander's answers became less convincing. Realizing he was losing control, he quickly changed his story. He claimed that Julia not only refused to move on but had also faked her pregnancy to try to keep him. In a last-ditch effort to support his lie, Alexander even created a fake DNA test. He modified a file he found online and presented it as evidence that he was not the child's father. Although Allegra initially believed him, her doubts persisted. She couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to the story than she knew. A few days later, Allegra decided to investigate for herself. While Alexander was sleeping, she took his phone, found Julia's number, and sent her a message. Julia replied almost immediately, and her tone wasn't one of revenge. Rather, she was also seeking answers. The next day, Allegra proposed they meet in person. Both women realized that this conversation had the potential to change everything. On May 27, 2023, they agreed to meet at Armani Hotel where Allegra worked, feeling a mix of tension and determination. Allegra was still unaware of the full extent of Alexander's betrayal, while Julia was shocked to learn that the man she had envisioned a future with was living a double life. Their meeting began cautiously. Allegra spoke first, revealing what she had uncovered. She explained how Alexander had convinced her that his past relationship was completely over, and she mentioned the supposed DNA test that indicated the baby wasn't his. Julia listened intently. Once Allegra finished, Julia calmly clarified that the test was fake. She had never asked for a test, and the timeline of her pregnancy corresponded perfectly with their relationship. More importantly, she disclosed that she and Alexander were still living together, and he had never given her any indication that their relationship was ending. As the minutes passed, Allegra began to see the reality of the situation. She realized she had been deceived from the beginning. Her entire view of their relationship changed, and for the first time, she felt certain about the truth. Although she was hurt and disappointed, she held no resentment toward Julia. It became painfully clear that both women had fallen victim to the same web of lies. Their conversation lasted more than an hour as them shared details, gradually uncovering the full extent of Alexander's deceit. Eventually, they moved from seeing each other as rivals to feeling connected. In that moment, Julia made a decisive choice. She was finished with Alexander. Her future was for herself and her child. Alexander had no role in it now. Upon returning home, Julia confronted Alexander right away, revealing that she knew everything and that their relationship was over. He initially denied everything and then became defensive, accusing her of intruding into his private matters. However, Julia disregarded his excuses, firmly stated that she was leaving for Naples and didn't want any further contact with him. That evening, she texted her mother and sister to explain her decision. They fully supported her and offered assistance in any way they could. Julia reassured them, saying she needed to handle a few things in Milan first but would be home in a few days. After their conversation, Alexander realized he had lost control. Everything he had concealed was now revealed. Julia knew the truth about his double life, his lies, and his manipulation. She no longer trusted him or listened to his words. She had made a firm decision to leave him. That day, the tension between them reached. Julia ignored all of Alexander's attempts to engage her. She focused solely on packing her belongings, showing no emotion. Her silence only intensified his frustration. Alexander pleaded with her, insisting she was making a mistake, declaring his love, and urging her to reconsider, but Julia remained silent. His anger escalated as he raised his voice in desperation, seeking any reaction from her. When he realized she had made up her mind, a wave of uncontrollable rage consumed him. In a moment of blind fury, he grabbed a knife from the counter and attacked. Julia had no opportunity to defend herself. The assault was swift and precise. But for Alexander, it was not enough to stop there. Driven by panic and fear of being exposed, he continued his assault, losing all sense of restraint. Realizing he needed to eliminate the evidence, he dragged her to the bathroom. He poured alcohol over her and set her on fire, hoping the flames would destroy any evidence. However, the fire only caused burns and did not fully consume. Frantically, he grabbed rags, cleaning supplies, scrubbing the blood from the floor, walls, and furniture. Despite his efforts, the stains persisted. The apartment still resembled a crime scene. He understood that he couldn't completely erase what had happened, but he believed he could find a way to avoid being held responsible. Having failed to destroy the evidence through fire, he needed a new strategy. His first step was to stage her disappearance, making it seem like Julia had left on her own. He took her phone, began messaging her family and friends. Knowing they would be concerned if she suddenly went missing, he crafted messages to imply she had chosen to leave. He sent a brief, vague text to her mother, stating that she needed some time alone. Then, he messaged one of her friends, claiming that she had left but wasn't ready to discuss her whereabouts. He intended to buy himself some time to make it appear that Julia had simply vanished. However, his plan didn't stop there. He was aware that someone would eventually alert the authorities, so, on May 28, 2023, he went to the police and reported Julia missing. He claimed that they had an argument and she left the house, never to return. His story was straightforward. That morning he had gone to work, and when he came back, she was gone. He's saying that her personal belongings, including her passport and money, were missing, implying she had left town voluntarily. Investigators paid close attention, but right from the beginning, something felt off. His behavior raised suspicion. He spoke too confidently, almost as if he already knew what questions the officers would ask. In contrast to Julia's family and friends, who were frantic, desperate for information, he remained unsettlingly calm. While the police organized a search, Alexander concentrated on concealing the evidence. He wrapped the body in a plastic bag and moved them to the garage. Over the next few days, he relocated the body several times, first hiding them in the basement of their building, then bringing them back to the garage. He was trying to find a way to get rid of them for good, but the longer he waited, the more mistakes he made. Investigators started examining his statements closely, interviewing neighbors, and searching for inconsistencies. He thought he was still in control, but law enforcement was closing in. After Alexander reported Julia missing, the police followed their standard procedures for such cases. The first significant clue came when forensic specialists found traces of blood in his car. Despite his attempts to clean it, modern technology allowed investigators to identify the biological evidence, which was confirmed to belong to Julia. The second piece of evidence was uncovered in the common areas of their apartment building. Faint reddish stains on the stairs and in the hallway initially appeared to be dust or spilled liquid. However, chemical testing revealed they were traces of partially cleaned blood. Investigators noted Alexander's strange behavior. Unlike most people whose loved ones disappear, he showed little genuine concern. He did not reach out to Julia's family for help in finding her, nor did he actively participate in spreading information about her disappearance. He only completed the formal steps to report her missing, which raised further suspicions. A major breakthrough in the case occurred when detectives analyzed his electronic devices. They confiscated his phone, computer, and tablet, revealing alarming findings. First, they discovered a search history that dated back several months before the crime. He had been researching poisons, learning about the effects of various toxins, and reading articles on how to discreetly harm someone. Some searches even questioned why certain toxic substances might fail to work. Another crucial piece of evidence was the forged DNA test he had shown Algra. Forensic analysis confirmed that the document had been tampered with and that it was downloaded from a website that allowed users to edit medical records. As more evidence accumulated, Alexander's story began to unravel. Investigators increased their pressure, systematically highlighting inconsistencies in his account. Initially, he maintained his innocence, claiming he knew nothing about it. However, with each interrogation, the police presented undeniable facts. They showed him photographs of blood stains, confronted him with his search history. They brought in witnesses who reported hearing loud noises and shouting from Alexander's apartment. A significant breakthrough in the investigation happened when authorities examined Alexander's actions after Julia went missing. Surveillance cameras showed him making several trips to the garage, where he carried plastic bags inside and later came out empty-handed. Eventually, he confessed and revealed where he had hidden her body. On June 1, 2023, police found Julia's remains in a dense area near Sago. Forensic examination indicated that someone had tried to burn the body, but the attempt was not completed. Despite his efforts to conceal the truth, experts were able to determine how she died and gather conclusive evidence linking him to the crime. The tragic death of Giulia Tramontano shocked people all over Italy, a country where gender-based violence is a serious issue. After Alexander was arrested, protests began nationwide. Women filled the streets, carrying signs and demanding stricter punishments for domestic violence. Memorial marches took place in cities like Milan, Naples, and Rome, calling for systemic changes to better protect vulnerable individuals. At one rally, Giulia's sister, Chiara Tramontano, urged lawmakers to take action against the increasing number of cases where offenders face no significant consequences until it is too late. Forensic experts and investigators focused on understanding the psychological profile of Alexander. A psychological evaluation revealed troubling behavioral traits. Court-appointed psychiatrists determined that he exhibited strong narcissistic tendencies, showing no remorse for his actions. His behavior during interrogations and court appearances demonstrated a profound self-centeredness, an utter lack of empathy. He viewed others only in terms of how they could serve his interests, ignoring their feelings. His actions were motivated solely by a need to protect his reputation and keep control over those around him. Any perceived loss of power triggered a quick and dangerous reaction. During the trial, Alexander tried to appear remorseful, but neither Julia's family nor the public found his words convincing. He claimed to be baffled about how he could commit such a horrific act, asserting it was a moment of impulsive rage that he didn't fully recognize. However, prosecutors presented compelling evidence: his online searches for poisons, the attempted poisoning, the falsified DNA test, and the false report he filed with the police. Each piece of evidence demonstrated that the crime was premeditated. After Alexander's arrest, Algra decided to help the authorities. She provided them with her messages with him, revealing that he had lied to both her and Julia. During the trial, Algra also testified about the fake DNA test and his many attempts to manipulate her. As a witness, she was called by prosecutors to confirm important details, including how Alexander concealed his double life, lied about Julia's pregnancy, and made excuses when the truth began to emerge. She realized that if she hadn't stumbled upon those photos on his phone, the truth could have remained hidden for much longer. During her testimony, she expressed the guilt she felt toward Julia, even though she too had been a victim of his lies. After the trial, Algra chose not to speak to journalists, stayed out of the public eye, and tried to create some distance from the tragedy. Reports suggest that she later left Milan for another city, hoping to rebuild her life. The court found Alexander Impagnatiel guilty of first-degree murder, highlighting aggravating factors such as the cruelty of the crime, the ongoing emotional abuse inflicted on the victim, and his intentional efforts to destroy evidence. He was sentenced to life in prison. In the judge's closing remarks, it was stated that such crimes cannot be justified as mere lapses in control or temporary emotional turmoil. Alexander's actions over several months showed a clear and deliberate intention to eliminate Julia. Julia's case serves as a tragic reminder of the risks posed by individuals who view their partners as possessions. It raised awareness and contributed to a larger movement aimed at protecting those who are still in danger. Julia Tramontano's radiant spirit, marked by her ambition, warmth, and unwavering resolve, continues to resonate far beyond the tragedy that claimed her life. Her courage in the face of betrayal and her dreams for her unborn child remain a powerful testament to the strength of the human heart. Through the tireless advocacy of her mother, Loredana Femiano, and sister, Chiara Tramontano, Julia's legacy fuels a growing movement to combat gender-based violence, inspiring communities to stand united for justice and protection. In every heart she touched, Julia's light shines on, a beacon of hope and a call to build a world where no one suffers in silence. The Lundy family lived a quiet life in Palmerston North, New Zealand, a cozy town with a pleasant atmosphere. The spouses' names were Mark Edward Lundy and Christine Marie Lundy. At this time, they had been married for 17 years. They almost never quarreled and had one child, a daughter named Amber. She was cheerful, sociable, and becoming a model student in her elementary school. Amber was also a member of the Scouts. The Lundy family owned a business, which Mark ran as the public face of the company, while Christine took on a significant portion of the administrative work. However, they chose a narrowly specialized activity that was not very popular. As a result, the business did not develop as they had hoped. Despite their stubborn efforts to invest and grow the business, they incurred losses, which ultimately left them with about $100,000 in debt. As their business prospects seemed bleak, Mark decided to seek alternative sources of income. In 1999, he purchased 2 plots of land in Hawke's Bay, New Zealand, about a 2-hour drive from their family home, where he planned to invest in a winery and grape growing. He hoped this new venture would support him, but unfortunately, that did not materialize. He missed payments for the land, and due to late fees, the new business quickly began to incur even greater losses. Mark missed several payment deadlines, resulting in interest penalties of approximately 14%. At the time of the murder, the Lundy family owed $140,000 in interest penalties. The final deadline was August 30th, 2000, the day his wife and daughter were found dead. On the morning of August 29th, 2000, Mark went to Pet 1, near Wellington, about 150 km from Palmerston North, to address some business-related matters and to sell a couple of kitchen sinks, which was a common task for him. Around 5 p.m. that same day, he checked into a motel in Pet 1. Half an hour later, he called Christine, and they spoke for 8 minutes. She shared her plans of taking Amber out to dinner at McDonald's. After their conversation, she made another call to a friend and then left with Amber for dinner. Later, a receipt from the cafe was found at their home, but there was no further news from Christine. The next morning, Mark went to more meetings. He called Christine again, but she did not answer. After waiting some time and trying twice more, he found it strange that she was not responding. Normally, she would answer right away. Concerned, Mark decided to reach out to Christine's friend, but she seemed rushed and unable to help. At around 9 a.m., Glenn Wedgery, Christine's brother, went to Lundy's house to see Christine about his GST return. A horrifying scene unfolded before his eyes as he entered the house. He saw both Christine and Amber in tragic situations. Immediately, Glenn notified the police and Mark. Upon arriving in Palmerston North, Mark found that the road to their house was blocked by police. He was detained and told he needed to go with them to the station because his wife and daughter were deceased. Overwhelmed with grief, Mark could not believe what they were telling him and was visibly distraught. The officers decided that the news was too much for him, so they took him to the station in a patrol car. Once at the station, Glenn was already there. Glenn owned a small business and occasionally sought help from Christine with administrative issues. On the morning of August 30th, he first called Christine to confirm whether she was busy, but she did not answer. Knowing that his sister was responsible and unlikely to cancel a planned meeting at the last minute, he decided to go to her house. Rarely using the main entrance, and out of habit as a close relative, he entered through the back door. To his surprise, Glenn found that the back door was wide open and it was suspiciously quiet inside. At first, he decided not to attach any importance to it. He walked inside and greeted the family, but no one answered. When Glenn walked around the house, he understood why he was being ignored. First, Glenn found Amber. More precisely, he thought it was Amber because given the state of the body, it was difficult to identify the girl. She showed no signs of life. He checked her pulse and confirmed that she was dead. Glenn noticed how badly her head was disfigured. It looked like a bloody mess. Then, he found his sister lying naked in bed. Her head and face were also badly disfigured. Glenn immediately called the police. While waiting for law enforcement, he remained in the house, sitting at the kitchen table, not understanding what could have happened to his loved ones. When the police and paramedics arrived on the scene, they immediately assessed the scale of the attacker's cruelty. The scene showed that both Christine and Amber had been attacked with such fury that parts of their brain and skull fragments were found on the floor and walls. A large piece of brain matter was even found on the ceiling in Christine's bedroom. Judging by the position of the bodies, it seemed Christine had tried to escape, but the attacker caught up with her in the hallway and beat her to death with blows to the head from a heavy object. The house was carefully examined, and it turned out that only Christine's jewelry box was missing. The police had no clues. Forensic experts were only able to find a broken latch on one of the windows, suggesting the thief probably entered through it. Additionally, there was a small blood stain here, which seemed too far from the scene of the attack and was likely left by the criminal. Despite the fact that some valuables were missing, this crime did not appear to be related to robbery and seemed more personal in nature, given the severity of the attack. Mark was obviously traumatized by the news of his family's death. Even when he was brought to the police station, he still could not formulate his thoughts coherently. However, after a while, he calmed down and was able to communicate with law enforcement officers. He described in detail the last day of his trip on the eve of the massacre. He had a reliable alibi since he was in another city engaged in selling kitchen sinks, which was confirmed by numerous witnesses. Mark described his nearly two-decade marriage as a sincere and loving relationship, but admitted that he had not had intimacy with his wife for quite some time, which seemed like a serious contradiction. Mark was reluctant to go into intimate details about his marriage, as if he were hiding something. Nevertheless, during questioning, he admitted that to compensate for the lack of an intimate life, he periodically used escort services. While Mark was at the motel, he read a book, drank half a bottle of rum, called a business partner at 8:28 p.m., and then at 11:30 p.m. contacted an escort agency and used the services of a call girl. He left the motel early in the morning and went on business, and by 8 a.m., he was already selling sinks. Mark's first client also told the police that he had tried to contact his wife several times that morning, but she had ignored his calls. After Mark's interrogation, the police were almost certain that he was innocent. At least, he did not raise any suspicions. The only questionable point in his story was his regular infidelity, which he had tried to hide during the early stages of the interrogation. As a result, his behavior was attributed to guilt over his infidelity. Mark was released, but they did not remove him from the list of suspects, as further checks of many facts were necessary since husbands are often responsible for such crimes. Law enforcement agencies briefly mentioned that Christine and Amber had died from multiple blows to the head from a heavy object, something like a weapon or small axe. However, nothing like this could be found at the scene of the massacre. A later forensic examination allowed investigators to find remnants of Fleck brand paint in the victim's hair, and its color was identical to that which Mark used to mark his own tools in case he lent them to someone. After comparing these facts, the police began searching for something like an axe that could be on the list of Mark's tools. Mark confirmed that there should be an axe in the garage, but it was not found during the search. The tool had disappeared. The most suitable place to dispose of the weapon was a river flowing near the crime scene. Several groups of divers combed the bottom but found nothing. Despite this, the detectives were sure that Mark was not involved in the murder and that the criminal had simply used his axe. However, this belief was not universally shared. At the funeral of his wife and daughter, Mark was heartbroken. He cried during the entire service, could not even get up when everyone else did. He had to be escorted to the car because he could not walk normally. Many thought that Mark was simply overacting, trying to hide his guilt and confuse everyone. While Mark's family supported him in every way and confirmed that it was very difficult for him. However, the rumors proved impossible to stop. Everywhere Mark went, people looked for some kind of catch and tried to find a way to incriminate him. It got so bad that the police even had to hold another press conference at which law enforcement officers confirmed that Mark was essentially another victim in this situation, just like the deceased, so he was not considered a suspect in the murder. At the same time, forensic experts continued to collect information, and inconsistencies began to emerge. It turned out that a few hours before the murder and for several hours afterward, Mark's phone was disabled. This was contrary to the usual activity of a man who often received calls. Then a woman came to the police station, introducing herself as a neighbor of the Lundy family, Margaret Dance. The witness reported that on the night of that fateful day, she went to a choir rehearsal at about 7:15 p.m. As she was leaving, she saw a stout man running down the street, dressed in overalls, with light curly hair that looked like a wig. It seemed that it was a man trying to disguise himself as a woman. When the stranger ran past her, she recognized Mark. He ran by without saying a word or turning around. Margaret was sure that it was Mark, who should not have been in the area because of his absence, and all of this seemed suspicious. Following this statement, the police officers decided to check on Mark again. This time, they obtained a warrant to search his car, exposing the interior thoroughly. Mark admitted that he had driven it on the night of the 30th. Having analyzed the clothing found, forensic experts discovered two stains resembling blood, a large drop that belonged to Mark and a smaller one that belonged to Christine. However, the second stain was very small. Given the brutal nature of the massacre, the criminal should have stained much more, considering that the walls and even the ceiling were splattered with blood. Forensic experts suggested that the trace could have appeared on Mark's shirt before. Perhaps Christine accidentally cut herself while cooking and stained her husband's shirt. The other blood stain belonged to Mark and was much larger. In its center, forensic scientists found a small mucus substance the size of a grain of rice. They assumed that the owner of the shirt might have blown his nose into it but decided to conduct a more thorough analysis. For this, they invited an expert who used a new testing technique called immunohistochemistry. Based on the results, the specialist concluded that the mucus substance was indeed a piece of Christine's brain, which could not have ended up on Mark's shirt. Investigators suggested that these particles got onto the shirt via the jumpsuit, which had most of the bloodstains, that Mark simply disposed of the clothes by throwing them into a garbage container far from his home. It seemed probable that Mark was indeed near the crime scene at the time of the murder. After checking the chronology of events, detectives realized there was a 3-hour window for which Mark had no confirmed alibi. To accurately determine the time of death of the victims, additional tests were required. The forensic expert examined the contents of the stomach of the deceased, concluded that the time of death for Christine and Amber coincided with the 3-hour window that Mark needed to account for. To prove that he could have made such a long trip, the police obtained a receipt for Mark's gasoline purchase, then compared the amount of gasoline he used that day, questioned him in detail, and calculated the approximate mileage. However, it turned out that he consumed much more gasoline than was required for the trip to and from the city, about twice as much. All this did not fit into the overall picture and raised even more suspicions against Christine's husband. Now, detectives began to take Mark seriously as the main suspect in the double murder. According to investigators, after the massacre, he broke the window latch and stole a jewelry box. He also undressed his wife to confuse the investigation with contradictory details. Then, he disposed of the murder weapon, overalls, and the blonde wig he had been wearing that morning. After that, he went to a neighboring town to sell the stolen items while maintaining the illusion that the situation was normal. He even created a fuss and called his friend, asking her to check what had happened to Christine. In turn, Mark continued to insist on his innocence. The investigators lacked direct evidence: a jumpsuit, a wig, a jewelry box, and an axe. All of these were missing, making it impossible to take fingerprints. The detectives decided to verify their conclusions by independently driving the route that the alleged criminal should have taken in 3 hours. With great difficulty and constant speeding, they managed to approximate the time gap theoretically. Given a sufficient reserve of time and not wasting it, Mark could have dealt with his family. It was surprising how he managed to avoid being stopped for constant speeding on the way in both directions. The motive for the crime was still in question. After all, the Lundy spouses seemed to be a loving couple, making it hard to believe that Mark was capable of killing his wife and daughter. The detectives decided to investigate issues in the family's financial situation. As it turned out, on August 28th, the day before the murder, Mark received a notice that he urgently needed to make a payment for vineyard land, or he could lose it. He had only 5 days to do so, and the penalty for failing to comply was significant: $140,000, a sum the family did not have. On the same day, Mark suggested to Christine that they increase the amount of her life insurance policies from $200,000 to $500,000. They followed through, although there was naturally no reasonable justification for such additional expenses. A day later, someone dealt with Christine and child. All this seemed even more premeditated given the timing. When his wife and daughter died, the new policy had not yet taken effect. In fact, even if his bloody plan succeeded, Mark would not have received the expected payout. After Christine's death, however, the insurance company paid $75,000 toward the mortgage, but Mark never saw it. In February 2001, Mark, whom law enforcement initially supported, was arrested for the murders of Christine and Amber. He was denied bail and awaited the start of the hearing behind bars. The trial was scheduled for 2002. The prosecution claimed that he killed his wife and daughter for the insurance money, with his primary target being his wife. Amber became an accidental victim. He did not intend to harm her, but when the girl witnessed the murder, he was forced to take action. The jury heard the entire list of arguments and evidence against Mark. Unfortunately, the prosecutor's office lacked the murder weapon, but they believed that the evidence of his guilt was already sufficient to convince the jury. Mark, contesting the prosecution's claims, had his defense attorney argue that a loving husband would never harm his family. The lawyer pointed out apparent gaps and inconsistencies in the prosecution's tactics. After considering both sides, the jury deliberated for 7 hours. Mark was found guilty of double murder and sentenced to life imprisonment with the possibility of parole after 17 years. However, the fight for his freedom was just beginning. Only the lawyers and Mark were dissatisfied with the verdict. They promptly began the appeals process, but 4 months later, the appeal was rejected and the minimum time for parole was increased to 20 years. Interestingly, at this point, Mark's support grew even more, contrasting with his initial situation after the tragic death of his family. The prosecution provided a highly questionable timeline that seemed far-fetched. In light of this, those who previously considered Mark a killer began to shift their stance. The 3-hour time frame in which the crime occurred appeared implausible, given the journey and the disposal of evidence involved. Even with a high speed of about 120 kilometers per hour, the police could only travel from city to city in approximately 1 hour and 33 minutes. It would have taken even more time to deal with 2 victims and dispose of the murder weapon, in addition to returning. All of this seemed unrealistic. To dispute the allegations, even a drop of brain matter found on Mark's shirt was scrutinized, as the method of analysis used was deemed too inaccurate. 7 years after the trial, an article was published about the tragic massacre of the Lundy family, detailing arguments that were previously unknown to the public. It meticulously refuted all the prosecution's claims, even questioning the words of the neighbor, Margaret. Some inconsistencies, including the time frames she provided, did not match the prosecution's narrative. At the trial, she indicated that the murders were committed the evening before a scheduled visit, claiming to have seen a man at about 7:15 p.m. She stated that at that moment there were 7 people standing near the takeaway food shops who should also have seen Mark in disguise. However, none of them saw him running around the area in a wig. The prosecutor insisted that Mark had changed the time on his computer and had cleaned the system, but later, upon inspection, it was discovered that the hard drive had, in fact, been infected with a virus that was randomly corrupting files. Mark simply didn't know about it yet. At that point, even a reanalysis of the paint found in Amber's hair failed to find a match with the substance that Mark had used to clean his tools. The defense insisted that the police had focused on Mark from the very beginning. All attempts to acquit him from the start were more likely made to divert attention, a way to gain trust. The authorities had several other suspects who did not even have an alibi, but they were simply ignored. Soon after the article was published, Mark's defenders filed another appeal and turned to the highest judicial instance in New Zealand. This became the last chance to acquit Mark. The preliminary hearings took place in 2013, and the lawyers prepared a strong case that provided answers to all the controversial allegations of the prosecution. Thanks to this, everyone began to seriously doubt Mark's guilt. His defenders even secured his family's bail after 18 months pending trial, and this has been ongoing for 12 years. The hearings began in the spring of 2015, and interestingly, the prosecution radically changed its tactics. The prosecutor's office completely reworked the timeline, claiming that Mark committed the murder at night after returning home from a visit with a call girl, giving him enough time to get home, have breakfast in a cafe in another city, and continue his business trips. According to eyewitnesses, he behaved quite calmly and was in a good mood. Some of the controversial arguments were discarded, while others were reworked to better fit the situation. The prosecution clearly did not intend to give up. Even new witnesses appeared. For example, a cleaner who went to Lundy House on the 28th said that she sensed a lot of tension between the spouses. The defense also intended to present compelling arguments. New technologies now allowed for a different approach to assessing evidence. DNA samples from 2 unidentified men were found under the fingernails of Christine, which did not match the materials belonging to Mark. Additionally, it was discovered that during the initial investigation, the police had ignored several compelling pieces of evidence. For example, dark hair found in Christine's hand clearly did not belong to her. 10 hairs were found under the right fingernail and 11 under the left. The hairs were sent to the ESR for testing in 2 plastic bags. The bags remained untouched at the ESR for 9 months and were then returned to the police in June 2001. After his conviction in 2002, Mark wrote to the police asking that all material relating to his case be preserved. The police ignored this request and destroyed the hairs in December 2003. Detective Inspector Mark Hercock, the lead investigator at the 2015 retrial, confirmed that the hairs had never been examined or tested. The lawyer provided a new theory, suggesting that the killer could have been Glenn, Christine's brother, the very person who discovered the bodies and waited in the kitchen for the police to arrive. He had explained the scratch on his nose as a mark from a domestic cat, which led the police to leave him alone. At that time, however, the police had searched Christine's brother's house and car. They used luminol and found blood stains in both, but did not investigate further, which could have belonged to the murdered women. Glenn's neighbor admitted that he had long suspected Glenn of the murder because he had witnessed Glenn trying to dispose of some clothes. During the hearings, the prosecution claiming that Christine's brother had unhealthy tendencies and had molested Christine, leading to the deaths when she discovered it. Naturally, by this point, the defense had lost significant arguments to support these theories, as a lot of time had passed and traces were no longer available. Another strong point for the defense involved communication with an expert who identified the brand on the shirt. According to him, he had worked in a laboratory not intended for this kind of analysis. The technique was completely new and untested, and he likely made mistakes. The defense argued that the stains on the shirt could have originated from a meat pie. New studies were conducted with the best specialists, but they all concluded that the sample was poorly preserved and unsuitable for analysis. The only thing they could confirm was that the stain was from human tissue, but its origin was unknown, hence, this evidence was excluded as unreliable. Margaret was also not invited to the courtroom, and her testimony was disregarded. The defense presented a new theory regarding what could have happened to Christine and Amber. They argued that shortly before the murders, the family began receiving threats regarding debts, suggesting that someone came to the Lundy house to intimidate Mark into paying them off more quickly. This argument sounded quite convincing, but the prosecution insisted that only Mark had a substantial motive to get rid of his loved ones due to mounting financial problems and fear of being exposed by his wife as a bankrupt. The increase in the life insurance policy right before the murders seemed suspicious to the prosecutor and could not be considered coincidental. The jury deliberated for more than 15 hours. After these hearings, many jurors hesitated and could not reach a consensus. The Supreme Court upholding the previous verdict, Mark was sent back to jail to serve the remaining 8 years of his 20-year sentence before he could apply for parole. However, the defense did not give up and attempted to file an appeal in 2017, which became possible after changes in legislation. They focused on the obvious errors in the investigation and inconsistencies in the prosecution's version, but the court confirmed the sentence once more. The Court of Appeal ruled that the mRNA evidence was new science that had never been used before or since and should not have been presented to the jury, but upheld Mark's conviction. This was the interim provision, the mechanism that allowed the Court of Appeal to dismiss Mark's appeal. Mark's lawyer, Jonathan Eaton QC, then argued in the High Court that Mark had been the victim of junk science, and in May 2019 he was granted leave to appeal to the High Court, based solely on the interim provision argument. On December 20, 2019, the New Zealand High Court dismissed Mark's appeal, stating in its closing that other evidence demonstrates beyond reasonable doubt that Mr. Mark murdered Christine and Amber Lundy. Mark remained unable to fight for his freedom until 2022 when, in August, he was given the right to apply for parole. He was hopeful for release, but the commission refused, citing that he did not provide a plan to address his aggression issues. He maintained that he had not killed anyone and had no anger management problems, making it impossible for him to create such a plan. Despite the denial, a retrial of the appeal took place in May 2003. This time, the counsel sought to understand what motivated him regarding his family. Mark again insisted on his innocence, stating he would rather die in prison than admit to something he didn't do. This only worsened his situation, as he was denied release and required to undergo rehabilitation for alcohol issues he had faced before his imprisonment. Mark's relatives supported him, understanding he could not confess to a murder he did not commit, as this would destroy his struggle for freedom that had lasted for 2 decades. However, he remains hopeful of ever being released and continues to insist on his innocence. In 2025, North and South journalist Mike White revealed that other forensic evidence, such as hair samples from Christine's fingernails, had never been tested. A scientist had found blood-soaked fibers on a window next to the door where police believed the perpetrator had entered the Lundys' home. Police had also sent these fibers to the Institute of Environmental Science and Research, but again, they had never been tested. Police could not explain why the fibers had never been tested. After another hearing in April 2025, Mark was pardoned after serving 23 years in prison. He is scheduled to be released in May. He will face a variety of restrictions, including a ban on online dating, social media, and media interviews. He will be required to notify his probation office of any relationships or employment. The tragic case of the Lundy family remains one of New Zealand's most controversial and polarizing criminal cases. After over 2 decades of legal battles, Mark Lundy's pardon in April 2025, following 23 years of imprisonment, marked a significant turning point. The untested forensic evidence, such as the hair samples and blood-soaked fibers, raised serious questions about the integrity of the original investigation and the reliability of the evidence used to convict him. While some continue to believe in Mark's guilt, citing the financial motive and the timing of the insurance policy increase, others argue that the prosecution's case was built on circumstantial evidence and flawed science, leaving room for reasonable doubt. Mark's release, accompanied by strict probation conditions, reflects the ongoing tension between justice and uncertainty in this case. As he steps into a new chapter of his life, the unresolved questions surrounding the deaths of Christine and Amber Lundy continue to haunt those seeking the truth.
On the night before Halloween, October 30th, 2001, police were called to a home in the affluent Coral Gables neighborhood of Florida after an alarm was triggered. Upon arrival, officers uncovered a horrifying crime scene. A woman was found brutally murdered on her kitchen floor in what looked like a scene from a horror movie. Blood covered the walls, with splatters even reaching the ceiling, a clear indication of extreme violence. Investigators determined that the victim, 45 years old Maggie Lucasio, had been attacked after parking her car in her open garage. It appeared that the assailant had been waiting for her and struck as she exited the car. Though she managed to flee into the house, the attacker pursued her and ended her life there. Maggie was the estranged wife of Edward Lucasio, to whom she had been married for nearly 30 years. They had recently separated and had not been living together for months. Maggie had even attempted to file a restraining order against Edward. Their separation was part of a contentious divorce, driven largely by Edward's repeated infidelities. The process was further complicated by serious disputes over financial matters, making him the immediate prime suspect. Maggie and Edward had met in 1972 while studying accounting at the University of Miami. After graduating, they married and worked as accountants. In 1982, Maggie became a homemaker following the birth of their son, Eddie Jr. Over time, Edward climbed the professional ladder, founding his own company and managing the finances of wealthy Miami clients. Unlike Edward, who was sociable and charismatic, Maggie was described as more private and reserved. In 1992, they purchased a mansion in prestigious Coral Gables, but by 2001, Edward had moved into an apartment in South Beach, just 10 minutes away by car. When police contacted Edward, they withheld the true nature of the situation and told him only that there had been an issue at his former home due to an alarm. They asked him to come by to assist. Edward arrived shortly afterward, appearing calm and cooperative as he spoke with investigators. He displayed no concern or curiosity about why the area was surrounded by police tape or why there were so many officers present. His indifference was notable, especially given that his estranged wife Maggie still lived at the house. Detectives eventually brought him to the station for further questioning. During his interview, Edward explained that he and Maggie were going through a divorce and had stopped interacting. He acknowledged that their relationship had been strained, with disagreements escalating to the point where Maggie had sought a restraining order against him for alleged threats, domestic violence, and abusive behavior. The first hearing related to their divorce was scheduled for the next morning. When police finally informed Edward that Maggie had been murdered, he showed no visible reaction. Meanwhile, Edward and Maggie's 19-year-old son, Eddie, was also being questioned in another room at the station. Eddie stated that he had been at the library that evening, and his alibi was confirmed. After the interrogations, Eddie crossed paths with his father in the corridor. Unlike Edward, who remained emotionless, Eddie displayed visible anger and disbelief. Later, Eddie told reporters that at that moment, he became convinced his father was responsible for his mother's murder. Tensions between Eddie and his father had already been high in recent years, and this tragic event only deepened the divide between them. Eddie openly despised his father, viewing him as a personification of the worst human traits. Despite Eddie's doubts, Edward claimed he had spent the day playing golf and was in his apartment on South Beach, several kilometers from the crime scene. At the time of the alleged murder, CCTV footage from his apartment confirmed his alibi, proving he couldn't have been the killer. Even though Edward was quickly ruled out as the perpetrator, the police remained suspicious of him. He had a strong motive for wanting Maggie dead, and the violent nature of the crime suggested hatred, likely from someone close to her. Investigators considered the possibility that he might have hired someone to carry out the murder. While reviewing the details of the case, a detective recalled seeing a white pickup truck making an illegal maneuver near Maggie's house on the night of the murder. Although he had wanted to stop the driver, he was responding to an emergency call at Maggie's residence. Now, he suspected the truck's driver might have been fleeing the crime scene. When asked if he knew anyone who owned a white pickup truck, Edward denied it. The investigation intensified, and the next day, a local resident contacted authorities about a small sports bag found in the bushes between his property and Maggie's house. The bag turned out to be crucial evidence. Inside were a blood-stained knife, bloody clothing, and Maggie's stolen credit cards. The bag was sent to a crime lab for analysis, where investigators hoped to find DNA, fibers, or fingerprints to identify the killer. 2 days after Maggie's death, Edward reported a break-in at his office. Police found no evidence of theft, but the office was in disarray, with documents scattered on the floor. Taking advantage of the situation, detectives interviewed Edward's employees about him and his family. A worker revealed that Edward's brother, Michael Lacasio, owned a white pickup truck, the same type of vehicle spotted near the crime scene. This revelation marked a turning point in the investigation. Michael, who lived in Charlotte, North Carolina, was quickly located by police. His truck immediately attracted attention because the seats had just been upholstered. When police removed the seat covers, they found the old fabric was stained and showed signs of having been pressure washed, possibly to remove evidence such as blood, since a complete clean was not possible. The seats were upholstered with new fabric. Unlike Edward, Michael had a troubled history. At 41 years old, he was unemployed, struggling with a banned substance addiction, and had a prior fraud conviction. It seemed plausible that he might commit murder, particularly if motivated by a banned substance or financial gain. Although no incriminating evidence directly connected Michael to the crime scene, the sports bag near Maggie's house became a critical clue. Latex gloves inside the bag contained Michael's DNA. Tests ruled out Edward and Eddie, confirming Michael as the likely suspect. 2 weeks after Maggie's murder, the lab results were finalized, and Michael was charged with killing Maggie. Eddie was shocked to learn that his uncle, Michael, was involved in the incident. He suspected that Michael could not have acted alone, because how could someone who lives so far away travel so far just to commit a crime? Eddie suspected there was more to the story and thought his father might somehow be connected. Regardless, the police needed concrete evidence to prove anything further. While there was no direct evidence implicating Edward, his brother, Michael was preparing to stand trial. Meanwhile, Edward continued with his everyday life, going to work and even dating. Michael faced murder charges, with prosecutors hoping he would confess and implicate Edward, who was believed, according to Eddie, to be the mastermind behind the crime. Prosecutors were confident they could uncover the truth. especially given that Michael faced the death penalty if convicted. Despite strong pressure, Michael firmly refused to plead guilty or testify against Edward, asserting his innocence. During the trial, prosecutors made it clear they believed both Michael and Edward were involved. However, this did not change Michael's stance. Although the prosecution presented strong evidence against Michael, much of it was circumstantial. His defense lawyer argued that the evidence was questionable due to procedural errors during the investigation and lab work. Furthermore, there was no clear motive, and much of the case relied on indirect evidence. Despite these arguments, the jury deliberated for only 6 hours before finding Michael guilty of first-degree murder. He was sentenced to life in prison without parole, a punishment likely designed to pressure him into confessing or exposing Edward's role in the crime. After the verdict, Eddie stepped in, determined to fight what he saw as an unjust decision. At just 19 years old, Eddie had already graduated from college and was attending the University of Miami Medical School, where he excelled academically. His relationship with his father, Edward, had always been strained. He never even called him Dad, referring to him as Ed instead. He pursued his studies with one key purpose: to help his mother, Maggie, escape her abusive marriage. Despite his efforts, he was unable to save her. However, he gained financial independence and tried to help her secure a divorce. Starting with a court injunction against Edward, Eddie believed his father's refusal to split their assets fairly was at the heart of the conflict. Under Florida law, divorcing spouses were required to divide their wealth equally. Edward, whose fortune was estimated at $6 million, refused to comply. He even tried to hide some of his wealth, but Maggie, an experienced accountant, discovered his deception and was determined to expose it. According to Eddie, Maggie was murdered because she was planning to reveal Edward's hidden accounts to the court just hours before their divorce trial began. The day after her murder, Edward's lawyer petitioned the court to terminate the divorce proceedings due to Maggie's death, a move that struck many as suspicious and calculating. With the case dismissed, Edward stood to retain control of all the family assets. Eddie was horrified by his father's cold reaction to his mother's death. He seemed entirely unbothered, despite having been married to her for years. Edward's greed and lack of remorse convinced Eddie that his father was responsible for the murder. Seeking justice, Eddie filed a civil lawsuit to block Edward from taking complete control of the family fortune and won the case. However, he faced significant challenges with the criminal investigation, which stalled for years. After 4 years with no progress, prosecutors doubted they would ever uncover the truth. Everything changed in November 2005, when authorities decided to move forward with the evidence they had, believing no new leads would emerge. Edward Locascio was arrested and charged with first-degree murder and conspiracy to murder his wife, Maggie. Eddie saw this as a significant victory, but it was just the start of a much tougher battle. After spending 4 years securing a conviction against his uncle Michael for his mother's murder, Eddie now faced the challenge of bringing his father, Edward, to justice. This trial was far more complex due to the absence of direct evidence. In Michael's case, the crime scene held undeniable proof, including DNA and the murder weapon. However, Edward's charges rested solely on circumstantial evidence, giving his defense team considerable room to argue. The prosecution claimed Edward orchestrated Maggie's murder due to a strong financial motive. During their divorce proceedings, Edward stood to lose a large portion of his assets. Although he had hidden much of his wealth in offshore accounts in the Cayman Islands, Maggie had uncovered the deception and planned to expose him in court. Unwilling to let this happen, Edward allegedly convinced his brother Michael to carry out the murder. Prosecutors argued that Edward had not only planned the killing, but had also influenced Michael to commit the brutal act. Graphic photos revealed the horrifying nature of Maggie's death. She had been savagely attacked with both a knife and a baton. She suffered multiple blunt force injuries that caused fractures, and the assailant had continued stabbing her even after the initial beating. The prosecution contended that this extreme violence stemmed directly from Edward's malicious intent. With little concrete evidence tying Edward to the crime, the case relied on motive, circumstantial evidence, and key witness testimonies. The first major point of suspicion came from Edward's lack of reaction when he was informed of Maggie's death. Although there was no written or recorded evidence of a conspiracy between Edward and Michael, phone records showed a spike in the number of calls between the brothers in the weeks leading up to the murder. Previously, they had only communicated occasionally on special occasions, but records showed that they had begun calling each other on an unusually daily basis 6 weeks before Maggie's death. This sudden change became a major point of suspicion for investigators. The prosecution argued that Edward used these calls to pressure Michael into committing the crime and to finalize the plan. A critical witness was Edward's secretary, Gudile Gonzalez, who testified that she overheard several phone calls between Edward and Michael. After realizing the nature of these conversations, Gudile said Edward began threatening her, warning her to stay silent or risk being killed. Frightened, she eventually went to the police. Eddie, Edward and Maggie's son, also took the stand, recounting years of abuse Maggie suffered during her marriage. He described instances in which Edward had beaten his mother, threatened her, and even came close to hitting her with a heavy sculpture. According to Eddie, Edward openly threatened to kill Maggie 5 months before her death, after she revealed her intention to file for divorce. Tensions escalated when Maggie caught Edward having an affair with Eleanor Salazar, a masseuse. Eleanor also testified in court, stating that she was at Edward's house at around 11:30 p.m. on the night of the murder and witnessed a conversation between Edward and Michael. Surveillance footage from Edward's house supported Eleanor's account. The video showed Michael arriving at Edward's home around midnight, drenched and visibly distressed. He was seen gesturing wildly, which the prosecution interpreted as a sign that he had just finished cleaning blood out of his truck. Eleanor further testified that Edward later threatened her, warning that she would suffer a fate worse than Maggie's if she went to the authorities. Surveillance footage partially verified Edward's whereabouts that night. While bolstering Eleanor's credibility, financial records also uncovered Edward's multi-million-dollar offshore accounts, which he had concealed during the divorce to limit what Maggie could claim. This financial evidence reinforced the prosecution's claim about Edward's motive, emphasizing that Maggie's knowledge of his hidden assets posed a serious threat to him. Edward's behavior after the murder raised serious concerns. He quickly moved on with his life, even starting a new relationship. During an argument with his new girlfriend, Edward allegedly threatened her, stating that she would end up like his wife. Alarmed by this threat, she decided to report it to the police. In court, the prosecution presented a gruesome reconstruction of the murder. Using a mannequin, they demonstrated how Michael brutally attacked Maggie. She suffered 8 blows to the head with a metal baton, but remained conscious and tried to defend herself. The assault bent the baton, rendering it useless. Maggie sustained severe defensive injuries, including nearly losing a finger while trying to protect herself. Despite her resistance, Michael continued his attack, pinning her against a wall and eventually standing on her chest to ensure her death. Blood evidence found throughout the house supported the prosecution's narrative. However, Edward's defense focused on the lack of direct evidence linking him to a conspiracy with Michael. There were no written or recorded agreements or explicit discussions about the crime. However, the prosecution asserted that Edward had a clear motive, suspicious behavior, and personality, and called on the jury to consider the circumstantial evidence and witness testimony. Following the murder, no money was transferred to Michael, and Edward did not provide him with any support while he was in prison. Michael appeared to gain nothing from the crime and had no clear motive to kill Maggie. Initially, investigators speculated that the killer might have had a secret relationship with Maggie, but there was no evidence to confirm this, as they had no prior contact. Edward's lawyer argued that the attack was random, possibly driven by Michael's mental state or substance abuse. In contrast, the prosecution maintained that Edward had strong motives to want his wife gone. Adding to the complexity, Edward's defense painted him as a kind and loving husband and father. They presented photos of a happy family life and called witnesses to attest to his character. The defense also attempted to shift the narrative by suggesting that Eddie, Edward's own son, may have had a financial motive to target his father in order to inherit the family's wealth. The most damaging testimony came from Edward's secretary, Goodallay. She testified that Edward had threatened her and stated that Michael would kill Maggie. The defense countered by arguing that Goodallay's story had changed multiple times, which weakened her credibility. The prosecution explained her inconsistencies as stemming from her discomfort with Edward's explicit and obscene language, which she rephrased for the jury. Nevertheless, her changing story raised questions about her reliability. Further complicating the situation, the defense pointed out that Goodallay was in a long-term romantic relationship with the lead detective on the case, which raised ethical concerns. By the time of Edward's trial, she had been living with the detective for over a year. The defense argued that this relationship undermined her testimony, suggesting that her involvement was part of a deliberate effort to bias the case against Edward. Another key point presented by the prosecution was the 39 phone calls exchanged between Edward and Michael over the course of 6 weeks. Previously, the brothers had little to no contact, often going years without speaking. The content of these calls remains unknown. The defense argued that the calls were innocent, suggesting that the brothers had simply grown closer during Edward's divorce proceedings. However, the dramatic increase in communication heightened the suspicion surrounding Edward's involvement. The argument that Edward had a financial motive for murder was dismissed. Even if he had lost half of his assets in a divorce, he would still have remained a millionaire, making it illogical for him to take such a drastic action. The defense also claimed that Michael, due to his struggles with addiction and mental health issues, might have committed the crime without having a clear motive. They suggested Michael could have misinterpreted Edward's frustration over the divorce and acted impulsively against Maggie. Furthermore, the defense argued that Michael's unstable nature would have made it unlikely for him to remain silent and not implicate Edward, especially when facing the death penalty. After both sides presented their cases, the jury deliberated for several days. The case was challenging, as it relied primarily on circumstantial evidence. Initially, the jury debated Edward's and Michael's motives, but eventually focused on Edward's potential financial incentives and Michael's apparent lack of motive. On the third day of deliberations, the jury reached a verdict. Edward Locascio was found guilty of first-degree murder. His son, Eddie, and his grandmother were present at the sentencing. Eddie expressed relief over the verdict, feeling that justice had finally been served after 6 long years since his mother's death. Although Edward initially faced the possibility of the death penalty, the jury recommended a life sentence without parole, which was ultimately imposed. Given Edward's age, this effectively meant he would remain in prison for the rest of his life. However, the decision enraged Eddie, who firmly believed that the death penalty would have been more appropriate. 6 months into his imprisonment, Edward gave an interview where he continued to proclaim his innocence. He denied encouraging his brother Michael to commit the murder, claiming that he had hoped to reconcile with Maggie before her death. He insisted he never believed Michael was capable of such a brutal crime and alleged that both he and Michael had been framed. Michael also maintained his innocence and never confessed. Nevertheless, DNA evidence confirmed his involvement, and the timing of the murder, just before a contentious divorce hearing, was difficult to dismiss as mere coincidence. During the interview, Edward suggested that his son, Eddie, may have orchestrated the crime. He theorized that Eddie, eager to inherit his parents' fortune, might have set him up to take the blame. Edward reiterated that the divorce settlement would not have left him destitute, leaving him no reason to kill Maggie. Eddie strongly denied these accusations. Edward Locascio later passed away on August 30th, 2018, at the age of 67 in a prison hospital in Lake Butler, Florida. The home where the murder occurred was eventually sold for $3 million. Eddie went on to become a doctor, dedicating his life to helping others. Leslie Perlow, a 21-year-old woman, worked at the law library in the Palo Alto courthouse in California and lived there with her family. She led a normal life and was studying at Stanford University at the time of a tragic incident in 1973. With ambition and determination, she focused on developing her career before thinking about settling down and starting a family. On Tuesday, February 13, 1973, Leslie was last seen leaving work around 3 p.m. When she did not return home, her family initially assumed she might have gone for her usual walk around the Stanford campus, but as time passed and she still hadn't appeared, they began to worry. After contacting friends and colleagues, but no one had any information about her, the family organized a search. When their efforts led nowhere, they reported her missing to the police, who took the situation seriously and began investigating. 2 days later, on February 15th, officers discovered Leslie's body in bushes near the university campus. She had been strangled with her scarf and showed clear signs of a brutal attack, including bruises covering her body. Evidence revealed that she had been abused, and her underwear and pantyhose were stuffed into her throat. She was partially undressed, and blood stained her clothing. The autopsy confirmed strangulation as the cause of death, and further evidence, nail clippings and bodily fluids, indicated she had fought back fiercely. At the time, forensic technology, such as DNA profiling, was not advanced, and there were no criminal databases near where the body was found. Police found Leslie's orange Chevrolet Nova abandoned near an old, deserted building. Her shoes were still in the car, but no significant evidence was gathered from the car or the scene. Despite efforts to identify suspects, none of Leslie's friends, family, or colleagues could provide clues. Leslie, described by everyone as calm and unassuming, made the murder a huge shock to all who knew her. The investigation quickly stalled after all potential suspects close to Leslie were ruled out through verified alibis. After 5 days, law enforcement turned to the public for help, releasing details about her car and its isolated parking location, hoping for witnesses. Police received several tips through phone calls, though none led to viable leads. A month later, authorities discovered the body of a young man named Mark Roswell, who had died just half a kilometer from where Leslie was found. Mark has ties to the court where Leslie works, is currently on probation for distributing illegal substances. Investigators looked into the possibility of a connection between Leslie and Mark, suspecting that Mark's case may have been motivated by guilt. However, interviews with courthouse staff confirmed there was no known relationship between the two. Family and friends of both Leslie and Mark were unable to establish any link. After thoroughly investigating Mark's background, detectives found no evidence suggesting a history of violent crime. His only prior offense was dealing banned substances. Ultimately, Mark was ruled out as a suspect. Despite significant efforts, Leslie's case remained unsolved. During this time, a new lead surfaced when a police officer contacted the station. Although he had been off duty on the night Leslie was killed, he had seen her car by chance while driving home through a secluded area. According to his report, on Tuesday, February 13th, he noticed an orange Chevrolet parked near an abandoned building. The sight caught his attention because the location was usually deserted. Alongside the Chevrolet, he saw a gray car and a young man with long blonde hair standing between the two vehicles. Leaning over as if speaking to someone, he observed the situation for a while, but did not notice anything overtly suspicious, so he continued on his way. While his account provided some useful information, he unfortunately didn't recall the license plate of the gray car. Based on certain evidence, detectives began to suspect that Leslie might have been the victim of not just a violent crime, but also a serial killer. Their suspicions were reinforced by the fact that several serial killers were active in the state during the early 1970s. The media immediately picked up on this theory, and over the years, speculations arose that Leslie might have been a victim of infamous killers like the Zodiac or Herbert Mullin, both of whom were responsible for multiple murders in the region. Even Ted Bundy was considered a suspect, as he was attending school in San Francisco during this period and lived near Stanford. Another theory attributed her death to a cult known as the Angels of Death, whose victims were found in San Francisco. However, as the investigation struggled to gain traction, detectives explored every lead. Over time, prominent suspects such as Ted Bundy, the Zodiac, and others were cleared of involvement. A year after Leslie's tragic death, another devastating incident shook the community. On Sunday, March 24, 1974, 21-year-old Janet Taylor was preparing for a busy day of work and visiting friends. Her car had broken down the day before and was in the repair shop, so her father gave her a ride to work. After finishing her shift, Janet planned to stop by her friend Deborah's house. Janet was a young woman full of ambition. She had recently turned 21 and was the daughter of a well-known university coach. She worked hard as a university student and dreamed of a successful career. That evening, after spending time with Deborah, Janet realized around 7 p.m. that she urgently needed to return home to let the dogs out for a walk. Wanting to avoid inconveniencing anyone, she refused to call her father or accept Deborah's help. Instead, she decided to hitchhike to her home in La Honda, a short distance away in an area surrounded by nature reserves near Stanford. Confident in her decision, Janet believed there was no reason to worry, and Deborah didn't perceive any danger either, a mistake that would prove to be fatal. The next morning, Janet's boyfriend noticed that she hadn't returned home. Alarmed, he contacted her friends and family to try to determine what had happened, but no one had seen her. Later that same morning, a milk delivery driver traveling near Stanford noticed something suspicious on the side of the road. When he stopped to investigate, he made a horrifying discovery. It was the body of a young woman. When the police arrived, they identified the victim as Janet Taylor. She had been strangled with her own sweater. Although she was clothed, her shoes were missing. Oddly, her feet were clean, despite the heavy rain the night before. While her body was damp, the ground underneath was dry, suggesting she had been placed there after her death. Janet's clothes were torn, and, like Leslie's, her underwear and stockings had been forcibly shoved into her throat. Investigators confirmed that she had been abused before being killed and subjected to prolonged beatings. Some of her belongings were missing initially, but were later found scattered along the roadside. Her clothes had been discarded over a stretch of approximately 500 meters on both sides of the road, leading investigators to believe the killer had deliberately disposed of them while driving. Janet's body was discovered just 2 kilometers away from the location where Leslie's body had been found the previous year. Not only did both women share a striking similarity in appearance, but the perpetrator also used similar methods in both crimes. These resemblances strongly suggested that the 2 women had fallen victim to the same serial killer. The shocking connection alarmed the community, heightening concern as the realization of a potential serial murderer set in. Rumors quickly spread that a maniac was active in the area, leaving residents feeling unsafe. People criticized the police for failing to stop the violent crime wave gripping the city. One curious detail united the victims: they were all found barefoot, with their shoes discovered far from their bodies. The victims, all young women, were similarly dressed in raincoats, a coincidence likely explained by the weather. However, the absence of their bags appeared deliberate. It was confirmed that Leslie and Janet had carried bags, but these were never recovered. Some speculated that the killer kept the items as trophies, a behavior often associated with serial offenders. Once the similarities in the cases were identified, the 2 police departments began collaborating. Shortly after Janet's murder, Peter Thompson was attacked in a seemingly unrelated incident on March 30, 1974 in California. At 4:20 am, a passing motorist discovered Peter bloody and injured near his parked car by the roadside. The motorist called for help, and police arrived to investigate. In the back seat of Peter's car, they found broken beer bottles, which appeared to have been used to cut his face. Peter explained to detectives that he had picked up a hitchhiker who attacked him after provoking a conflict. Meanwhile, forensic experts searched the area around Peter's car and the spot where the hitchhiker was allegedly picked up. Nearby, they discovered an open beer pack matching the broken bottles found in Peter's car. At the same time, a deputy sheriff reported seeing a suspicious man with long blonde hair who ran away upon noticing the officer. Unfortunately, the man evaded capture. It is noteworthy that a person with similar characteristics was also seen near the scene of Leslie's murder. Detectives questioned Peter further, during which something unsettling emerged when asked for his contact information. Peter provided the details of a woman named Barbara Rocky, claiming he had met her before. Investigators soon learned, however, that Barbara had been murdered 2 weeks earlier, on March 11, 1974, in Utah, near the Grand Canyon. Barbara, a 22-year-old college student, had been killed after voluntarily going with her attacker. She was abused and then shot 5 times in the back with her own Magnum .357 pistol. Chillingly, her killer had carefully folded her clothes beside her body, suggesting an emotional attachment to her. Barbara's death raised further questions. Detectives discovered that she was acquainted with Janet Taylor, one of the other victims, a connection that appeared too coincidental to ignore. Peter's claim of knowing Barbara came under intense scrutiny, especially since he appeared confused during questioning and delayed his responses, as though crafting a story. However, the investigation ultimately revealed no evidence linking Peter to the murders. He had no motive, and it was confirmed that he was not in Utah at the time of Barbara's death. His account of the hitchhiker attack remained plausible, with no conclusive evidence to prove or disprove it. Nevertheless, investigators continued exploring possible connections between Barbara and the other victims, interviewing those close to her. This effort led them to Gerald Hicker, a former university classmate of Barbara's with a documented history of violence against women. Further investigation revealed that Gerald was responsible for Barbara's murder. Despite this breakthrough, no evidence linked Gerald to the murders of Leslie or Janet, even though Barbara's case bore similarities to the others. Ultimately, Gerald was charged only in Barbara's death, leaving the murders of Leslie and Janet unsolved. In March 1975, a year after Janet's disappearance, the investigation into her case took an unexpected turn. A local journalist reported that San Mateo County Sheriff's deputies had searched a rental room based on a tip from an anonymous source. The room had been rented by a long-term tenant who had moved out a few weeks earlier. The tenant was reportedly behaving suspiciously, and during the search, police discovered photographs of a woman resembling Janet Taylor, along with a newspaper article about her murder. The young man who had occupied the room was quickly located. However, he remained calm and claimed to have been a close friend of Janet. Witnesses confirmed their friendship, and his possession of the photographs and the newspaper clipping was deemed innocent memorabilia. As a result, he was not arrested. In July 1975, the San Mateo newspaper published another story, reporting that investigators working on Barbara's murder were exploring possible links to Janet's case and had uncovered new leads. Though no specific suspect was mentioned, a police officer stated that progress had been made and an arrest was expected soon. At that time, it seemed as if investigators were once again considering Peter Thompson's involvement. Janet and Barbara were acquaintances who were killed within 2 weeks of each other. Peter Thompson, a mutual friend, died under suspicious circumstances shortly after their deaths. Witnesses reported seeing a long-haired hitchhiker who matched Peter's description, driving a car associated with Leslie's disappearance. However, Peter was eventually ruled out as a suspect. After his death, the investigation stalled, and there were no significant developments for decades. The case remained dormant until 2008, when true crime enthusiasts speculated whether Ted Bundy could have been involved in the Stanford killings. Investigators explored this possibility, but found no evidence connecting Ted to the crimes. By that point, law enforcement had determined with confidence that Barbara's murder was unrelated to the murders of Janet and Leslie. Despite these conclusions, murders continued to occur in the Stanford area, and new victims occasionally emerged. For instance, in October 1974, Alice Perry was found murdered. Like the others, there were no immediate suspects. Authorities believed a serial killer might be targeting victims around Stanford, further complicating efforts to solve the original cases. These investigations extended well into the 1980s. When Ted Bundy was arrested and sentenced to death in Florida, he began confessing to unsolved murders, eventually admitting to 23 killings across Washington, Oregon, Utah, Colorado, and Florida. However, no documented murders were tied to Leslie and Janet. Investigators made several attempts to link him to the Stanford murders, but all efforts failed. He was executed in 1989, by which time authorities had definitively ruled him out as a suspect in the murders of Janet and Leslie through DNA evidence. These cases remained unsolved for decades, with frustration further muddling the investigation. For example, serial killer Herbert Mullin, who confessed to murdering 13 victims, killed his last victim on the same day Leslie disappeared, just a few kilometers from where her body was later found. Similarly, Ted Bundy had reportedly been in the Stanford area at the time of Leslie's murder, and her appearance matched his victim profile. However, DNA evidence eventually excluded him as a suspect. For many detectives, coincidences are rarely dismissed, but in this case, the overlapping incidents only clouded the investigation and delayed progress. Meanwhile, the real killer remained at large. The cases saw no breakthroughs until 2016, when investigators reopened several cold cases. They revisited the murders of Leslie and Janet, this time utilizing innovative genetic genealogy techniques developed by Parabon Nanolabs. Law enforcement had collected DNA evidence from the abuse and suspected killer at the very beginning, and all samples were sent for genealogical analysis. This seemed promising because the company's innovative techniques had already solved several cold cases that had remained unsolved for decades. After completing the genealogical analysis, detectives received the results. Using the DNA profile, they created a family tree, and by 2018, the police identified a possible suspect. However, they couldn't confront him directly. Instead, detectives began discreetly monitoring 74-year-old John Guthrie. One day, during surveillance, John and his wife visited a coffee shop. After drinking his coffee, John discarded his cup in the trash. Detectives quickly retrieved the cup and sent it for testing. The DNA sample from the cup matched 100% with the traces found on the bodies of Leslie Perloff and Janet Taylor. In 2018, John was living with his wife in Hayward, California. He was arrested for the murders committed in 1973. 45 years after the crimes, investigators discovered that John, a medical technician at Stanford Hospital at the time, had no known connection to the victims. During the initial investigation, John had already attracted suspicion due to his criminal history. His record showed a pattern of incidents of an abusive nature, with his criminal behavior beginning in his youth. For instance, on June 8, 1963, when he was 18, John offered to walk 15-year-old Margaret Williams home after a dance near the military base where she lived with her family in Bad Kreuznach, Germany. Margaret never made it home. When Margaret missed her curfew, her family immediately alerted the police. Within 2 hours, her body was found. Witnesses helped authorities identify John as the perpetrator. He had taken Margaret to a baseball field, assaulted her, abused her, and killed her by striking her on the head. Found guilty, John faced a maximum sentence of 10 years under the laws at the time. Ultimately, he served 6 years in a juvenile prison and was released early in 1969 under the condition that he leave Germany. He returned to the United States, secured a job at a hospital, and married his colleague Susan, who had a daughter, Katie, from a previous relationship. For 8 years, John appeared to be a decent family man. However, during this time, he abused his stepdaughter Katie, threatening to kill her mother if she reported him. Katie later described him as a monster. In 1977, Susan caught John abusing her daughter Katie. They divorced, but for reasons unknown, Susan did not report the abuse to the police. A few months later, John married Linda Caputa, with whom he remained married for 24 years, until her death in 2002. They had 2 children, and John appeared to be a loving and responsible father. For years, John's children and others believed the allegations against him were false, unaware that he had killed Leslie in 1973 and Janet in 1974. In 1975, however, John was involved in another crime that finally drew law enforcement's attention. He was charged with abusing a 17-year-old girl in Santa Clara County while serving as a leader of a youth scout organization. He pled guilty as part of a plea bargain and received a lenient sentence, 6 months in prison and a small fine. This crime demonstrated that he was prone to abusing and strangling his victims, but authorities still did not connect him to Leslie and Janet's murders. At one point, John was even considered a suspect. A San Mateo County Sheriff's deputy noticed that John's criminal behavior closely resembled the killer's methods in the Janet Taylor case. However, in the 1970s, DNA technology was unavailable, which prevented law enforcement from creating a DNA profile to confirm his guilt. Decades later, with advancements in DNA technology, John Guthrie was finally identified as the primary suspect in these brutal crimes. The investigators reanalyzed all the evidence they possessed at the time, which led to the development of a male DNA profile based on biological fluid traces collected from the victim's clothing. When this DNA was compared to a sample from John Guthrie, it was a 100% match, confirming him as the perpetrator. This revelation sparked mixed emotions, especially within the local community. Many criticized the police, as John had initially been wrongfully suspected of murdering Arliss Perry. The true perpetrator, when approached for arrest, took his own life, a tragic pattern that would repeat decades later. However, John was far from blameless in other violent incidents. As investigators delved into his past, they uncovered that he had lived in Aga and New Jersey for several years, during which women frequently reported similar attacks. These findings suggested he may have been responsible for many more crimes. While authorities investigated John's potential involvement in other unsolved murders, prosecutors in 2 counties prepared for trials linked to separate cases. After the arrest of a suspect in Leslie's murder, the same individual was charged 6 months later with Janet's murder. In both cases, DNA evidence served as the primary foundation. Janet's and Leslie's families were determined to seek justice. They refused to negotiate, ensuring the criminal would face the full consequences of his actions. During the trial, Susan's daughter, Katie, who had suffered abuse at his hands and was familiar with John's cruel tendencies, provided crucial testimony. Upon learning about the murders, Katie was horrified to realize she could have become one of his victims. She recalled how she and John would pass the location where Leslie's body was found nearly every day on their way to school. At the time of both crimes, John was approximately 30 years old. Notably, witnesses described a suspect with long blonde hair at the scene, raising questions about whether John had an accomplice or whether he disguised himself by wearing a wig. On September 15, 2021, John Guthrie, then 77 years old and in custody, was convicted of Janet Taylor's murder. He was sentenced to life imprisonment without the possibility of parole. In 2023, he confessed to Leslie Perloff's murder and received a second life sentence. While this confession offered some relief to the victims' families, it was devastating for John's loved ones, who had steadfastly believed in his innocence. Following these convictions, his children publicly disowned him. Later that year, John passed away in prison. According to the official report, his death was due to natural causes. Detectives remain convinced that he was responsible for other murders, but have yet to gather sufficient evidence to conclusively link him to additional crimes.